Yes, I can give a few opening remarks and then just a few minutes and then let you give the real introductory remarks. Is that okay?
It's okay. Yeah.
Maybe
Short introductory.
yeah, maybe we can wait a few more minutes.
Yeah, we still have the 3 minutes to come. And,
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's still a few more coming. For example, Sanne.
Yeah. Okay. Oh yeah, Dr. Sanne. She has no paper to be presented, to be shared?
No.
No.
Okay. So then I have to make my...
Yes, comments.
Or ook een stream tag in.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, did Sanne app or email anything? Do you know that?
No, not yet.
All right. Well, it is very, very early where she is right now. She lives in Michigan. So I think it is 6 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, I understand. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yeah, it's very early for us.
So you have to very early.
Yeah, it is very early. Might also be
yeah,
technical difficulties or something like that.
And also Yuda, perhaps Yuda also.
Yes, I think for him it is even 1 hour earlier. Yeah, but he won't be joining today. He will only be there tomorrow, unfortunately, as he has to teach today.
Okay.
Well, I think as it is almost time, how about we officially start? So let me welcome everybody at this joint symposium of Leiden University and Gajah Mada University, and also an especially warm welcome to all the spectators and students through the live stream. It is very good of you to attend. Well, a short background on this symposium. It was conceived last February to take place physically at Gajah Mada University in October, so about right now. And although that could not come to pass, we are still very happy and eager to engage over our topics through Zoom online. Well, regarding the symposium itself, the topic or the subject, a few words. We initially conceived to make it thematically somewhat close to our, or actually Alicia's research project in Leiden, and thought of terms like localities of colonialism or colonial workplaces, which refers to the construction of colonial narratives or even ideologies in places where the colonial encounter took place, as Dutch colonialists, local populations, and all involved actors together built colonial society, interacted, exchanged ideas, and thereby co-constructed narratives and also concepts of legitimacy. However, as you will have seen from the papers, the subjects of the participants and the range of topics is very broad. So this symposium now is first and foremost a rather informal symposium and serves as a first engagement over our topics. And it is, of course, especially important to stay engaged and active during these Corona times. A final remark, as this is a relatively informal symposium, we also didn't assign chairs to the sessions. So it would be best if the presenters mind the time allotted to them and the order of things, and also shortly introduce themselves and their backgrounds. But me and Philip, I today and Philip tomorrow, will also act as chairs on the background if needed, and mind the time and the order of things. All right, we have 4 sessions today, but first some opening remarks by Professor Morgana. So the floor is yours. Your microphone is still muted.
Thank you, Alex. I'm very happy that finally we can hold this meeting, and I'm welcome. Good morning, Leiden. In Leiden, you are Alicia here, Philip was there, and also good morning also in Michigan. I saw Dr. Ravensbergen already there. I'm very happy. Sorry for waking you up very early in the United States. And also my colleague here, Farabi, Fakih, Wahid, and also Dr. Agus Suwignyo. And welcome everybody who is joining us today with Zoom meeting. As Alex already mentioned, that actually it's this meeting has been planned last year, and then should be held in Gajah Mada in this November. But unfortunately, because of this Corona, COVID-19, then we have to cancel and all change to this Zoom meeting. But I hope this will be no any obstacle with. I hope that technically will be okay with this kind of meeting, and we could also invite. So it's still so many people. I saw here that 44 people are already joining with us, and I'm expecting more from our own student here in Gajah Mada University. And I'm very happy that this is for the first time we could, collaborate in this kind of technical meeting, like using Zoom or other media. Perhaps in the future we could also doing this more often, not only in this kind of symposium, but perhaps also general lecture or teaching, something like that. And we could also do the same. We give also lecture to Leiden University student. And I'm happy also that finally, actually this topic is quite interesting. And we are in UGM already made some research. Our colleague already started 2 years ago. Actually, we touched this topic, although specifically we're not concentrating on the what you call it colonial ideology and mentality, but our study on colonial history almost touching all this kind of topics. So like my own, I would present a paper that I already done 2 years ago and finished last year, just published this year. And then also Eugene Groho has also have a very interesting research on the colonial mapping. And Abi just last year finished a research on the medical history, health history. And also Mas Agus Suwignyo has last year also has a similar kind of research of topic that we're going to present today. So I hope this will attract audience here who are interested on colonial history to extend and expand their research topic. So that's what I can say. Thank you again, everybody who is joining us with the Zoom meeting today. Back to Alex.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Morgana. Let's hope indeed we can have a fruitful exchange of thoughts on these topics, and hopefully this is a good basis for further cooperation between Leiden and UGM. Indeed, let's move on to the first session of the day of Dr. Farabi Fakih. As Morgana already mentioned, medical history. The subject title is Are Municipalities Settler Colonies? The Technopolitics of Hygienic Governance in Java during the late colonial periods. Dr. Fakih, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alex. Yes, so hello everyone. I'm just gonna share my screen with you. I can. Okay, everyone can. everyone can see what my screen is. So this actually is an article I haven't finished yet. So I'm still finishing this article, and it is something. It started off as I've always had interest in urban history, so it's actually started off as discussions within municipal history, but which sort of veered off towards discussing on hygiene because of the centrality of hygiene or hygienic governance in terms of colonial ideology, actually also, but also in terms of governance, so governmentality. So the idea is, of course, is to look at capitalism as a biotechnological system. So if you look at, for instance, colonial encounter, the expansion of the Western world, it always integrates people and ecosystems of the non-West, right? And there's two forms traditionally in which this has been achieved. First of all is the idea of settler colonies, which happens in temperate climates, in which it usually results in the erasure of native society and ecosystem. So a sort of biological rearrangement of European farming and society to replace native society, in which it results in autonomous European society. We can see this most succinctly in places like the United States, Canada, or Australia, where indigenous society was completely replaced, but also the indigenous landscape was sort of rearranged for European expansion of European farming. But in other places where what happened was the creation of what is called plantation capitalism or plantation colonies, and these happen in tropical climates. So the difference is in the climates or in the biological conditions or what do you call that, ecology, and it can result in erasure. For instance, in America, in the tropical parts of the American continents, or it can result in the integration of traditional society. So the idea of plural society. What happened in these kind of expansion in plantation capitalist society is minimal white colonization, because the problem is with tropical acclimatization. And of course, the focus is not on expanding European farming, but on introductions of tropical crops that integrates tropical ecologies. Now, in both cases, colonial encounter produces knowledge and technologies, in which the changing of society and ecology produces knowledge and technology because of the inherently biotechnological nature of capitalism. So what's called the co-constitutive nature of empire. Now, something began to change in the 19th century, in which developments in the biological and engineering sciences have begun to allow for greater acclimatization, basically. So in the biological science, the development of what's called the germ theory, the idea that pathogens is the cause of disease, but also the rise of what's called the laboratory as a core institutional component for a new kind of hygienic system appeared, and in the context of engineering, of course, drainage, urban planning, and so forth. So it resulted in two things. First of all, the gradual acclimatization of the tropics, and this means that increasingly more white people can go and move into the tropics, and it results also in what happened throughout the world as global urbanization. So the rise of modern municipalities as we know it is very much related to the rise of these kind of knowledge on controlling hygienic issues. Now the discussion, I want to then shift to the Netherlands Indies, of course. Now in the Netherlands Indies, we can divide the colonial governance into two. Now it is a tropical society, as we all know, but it results in the formation of two forms of governance. In Java, it was the creation of a plantation society, in which, first of all, state protection of traditional society occurred. So there was a tendency for the state to be, what do you call that? To preserve traditional society, because traditional society was the cheapest way in producing labor, basically, right? And it results in the industrialization at the rural level, and there's a conservative nature against innovation. Now, outside of Java is what I would call the terra nullius of the outer islands. So these are places that are pristine, there are few people, there's no economy, and it's open for innovation. So this difference between Java and the outer island is in the governance, in the biological governance of Netherlands Indies. Now, in the 19th century, especially at the end of the 19th century, the application of hygienic science occurred in what was then called as the Deli Miracle. So what happened in the plantation colonies in the Deli in North Sumatra, right? In particular, the Snamba Matskapai and this particular doctor called Dr. W.A.P. Schuffner, who was a German doctor, but who later on became a professor at Amsterdam University and at the Tropical Institute in Amsterdam. But he made an interesting thing. He created a comprehensive healthcare system for coolies. So it was based on the laboratory and the creation of a laboratory and the various regulations that limit the behavior, the movement, and the culture of the coolies. Now, this is very interesting about Delhi is that because it's a society that was built from the ground up, it's terra nullius, all the components of it was imported from outside. It opened up for a lot of new diseases, but at the same time, it also opened up for a truly new way of building society upwards, right, from the ground up. And the Schuffner's system was to create a central hospital with a central laboratory, with an auxiliary hospital, with clinics, and administrations of various diet medications and so forth, based on the findings of European doctors in the tropics for malaria, beriberi, yaws, cholera, various other diseases. And it was a miracle because there was a massive drop in death rate, especially in Snamba Matskapai, in which used to reach up to 37% of total coolies, and it dropped to something around 2 to some. Anyway, death rates that were similar to European death rates, and actually better than the cities in Java. So what happened in the context of Delhi was a major success story. But it was framed also the discussion. So obviously the state thought, oh, we need to take this idea and implement it in Java. But there was a problem with the context that the discussion was that Delhi and plantation colonies were what's called dwanggemeenschap, or forced societies, in which then you can control the behavior and movement. But what's happened in Java and the traditional plantation colony there is it was what's called a vrije gemeenschap, free society. So they had a problem trying to how do you implement this kind of thing. Now Schuffner in 1914 moved to Wealth of Leiden and to work for the public health service. And to start looking at how to implement this kind of comprehensive healthcare system in a free society in Java. So this is the idea was to create on the basis of municipalities a healthcare system, and this, for instance, was made based on the Delhi healthcare system, but for municipalities by Dr. van Lochem, who was the head of the public healthcare service in the 10s and 20s. So this was the context of it was, of course, about hygiene. Now I sort of shift a bit because this then becomes about the question of the discussion on municipalities. And in particular, I want to highlight one particular person who is called H.F. Tillema. He was a very well-known hygienicist. He was a promoter of the decentralization of municipalities. So he was very much in the thick of municipal movement, but he was also someone who a lot of people within the municipal movement would think of as someone who they look up to, because he was like one of the first to sort of push for this. So he advocated the formation of what we might call a biological citizenship, in which the state took over what he termed as hereditary or genetic hygiene of society. And so the idea was hygiene was not just about making people not sick, but it actually has a core component of nation building, basically. So hygienic improvement was believed to allow for genetically inferior. Okay, so there's a problem with the increase in hygienic improvements, right? A lot of people, this is a European discussion in that if all people were safe, they were all reproducing. That means a lot of these people who are genetically inferior, they would be reproducing, and so the entire the genetic fitness of society would come down as a result of implementing hygienic science. This was this was one of the that pushed for discussion on eugenicism in Europe and in America and in various places. But Tillema was different in that he's a follower of a German eugenicist named Wilhelm Schallmayer, who advocated the promotion of the genetic development of all people. So Schallmayer is different from like Nazi ideas of eugenics, in which, you know, like the white people have to. In the idea of Schallmayer is that differences in genetics within race is much more important than in between races. So all races can be uplifted. And so the idea for Schallmayer is that the state or society had a duty to lift all the races. And Tillema took that idea and said, okay, this is what we need to do in the Indies, in that this is not just about health or economy, it is basically about increasing everyone's genetic fitness, basically. And he blames, now Tillema's idea is that he blames the reduction of genetic fitness not on a Darwinian idea of increasing genetically inferior people through reproduction, but as a result of culture, in particular of industrialization. So he would say, oh, look at all these, all industrial countries results in reduction of birth rates. Now, nowadays we know what the reason is, but at that time, he blames it on as a result of industrialization impeding or reducing genetic fitness. And in particular, the rise of the city or the rise of the municipality. So he was very critical of the city, but he also saw the city or the municipality as a potential to as a potential tool, as a biotechnological tool to increase genetic fitness. So I just want to maybe quote a little bit. I've already noted that the pastors, the leaders of the nation, the politicians pay very little attention to the great questions of public health. They do not consider that the spiritual possession of a people is worth more than the possession of goods. The fate of nations depends on that of individuals. The real national wealth consists in the health, ability, and strength of the citizens. Biological politics should therefore take precedence over economic ones. So it was arguing that that the Netherlands Indies has to be in the context of a biotechnological kind of society. So if you look at how did that occur then? How did municipalities took over? So municipalities was a biological citizenship, something that occurred in the context of the rise of municipalities. So hygienic applications to cities made it obviously acclimatized spaces for European migration. So there was increasing amount of European people living in these cities, in particular Bandung, because it was high up on the mountain. But the problem was the question of the kampung, right? So the kampung was always central in all the discussions among municipalities. And what I see is that there's a diverging biological citizenship between middle class and the kampung in the context of this idea of biological citizenship. Now, if I read like literature on the Dutch tropical colonization, what's interesting is that it doesn't stress on racial replacement. So it's not a settler colony in the traditional sense, but in spreading Dutch European culture as core for colonization. So the idea was that it was multiracial, but it was unicultural. And there were discussions especially in the 20s and especially in the 30s on colonization of white people in the Netherlands Indies, in the Batak Highlands, in West Papua, and in some of the mountain cities in the Indies. From these discussions, I want to try to then look at this as a different form of settler colonialism. So it's based on the rise of modern European cities. So it's not based on expansion of European farming, but it's based on the rise of modern cities, with the idea that it can push for European and Dutch national culture. And it imagined an autonomous urban European-based culture that was autonomous, that it could reproduce on its own. So very different from settler colonies in America or Australia, which stressed on the autonomous reproduction of farming, of European farming community. This one is based on the autonomous reproduction of urban European-based culture society. So was the municipal biotechnological idea, or did it fail? Well, obviously it did. And one of the major problems was that it didn't really attempt to, it had no idea what to do with the kampung. And so, and it never, and the main reason was money, of course, that it really didn't want to spend more money on, and so it never really developed. So there were various congresses on the kampung questions, but they never really developed it in a way that Tilma imagined it would, as a form of genetic hygiene. And plus the state also, the Netherlands Indian state was also very partial. They saw the municipality as a capitalist enterprise, so they tried to, and in the context of healthcare, it was only partially given to municipalities. So by the end of the colonial period, municipalities did not run the healthcare system and their own cities, and the healthcare remained national issues. Now, in the post-independence period, the idea of genetic hygiene was actually continued by the state. For instance, in birth control, keluarga berencana scheme of the New Order. So it's not something, it's something that continued. And it's an idea that's very global, obviously. But what's also interesting, I think, is that there is an urban autonomous society. This thing is important in understanding the cultural roots of post-colonial middle class Indonesia, in the sense that it was a developmental society without a program. Okay, this last part is a little bit something I have to develop further, but basically, this last part is to answer whether, you know, how do we understand settler society, and how do we understand that is it something that's even now has effect on Indonesian society in the present period. Okay, thank you very much. That was my presentation. I hope that was 10 minutes. So I give back to you, Alexander.
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting. It is, I guess, difficult to give you an applause online, but at least we all would applaud if this was a physical meeting. Yes, and very interesting. The importance of hygiene, of course, is also very relevant at the moment, the last few months. So that gives your topic an extra relevance. Now let's move on to Dr. Alicia Stricker for the comments.
Yeah, so thanks, Abi, for this very interesting paper. It's broad and at the same time very concise. You touch on, or you sketch a very long-term development, I think, in the relationship between hygiene politics and hygiene control under colonialism and in the post-colonial era, and both in plantation settings and in urban settings and urban development. So I'm just picking out a few things that I noticed, or that that I'm wondering about, because I think well, there are two issues where I just have a question. So the first is your division between Java and the outer islands, which I think is a bit of a simplified division that you make. I'm not sure if I like the term terra nullius here, because I think that is part of the colonial legal reasoning, maybe not always used by the Dutch, but by other colonial powers to claim their rights to land in what is now the US or in Australia. And so there are two reasons why I'm not so sure about using that term. One is that I don't think that this term was used that much by the Dutch, actually. And the other reason is that you present the outer islands as a space, so everything outside of Java as a space where experiments were possible, where the Dutch could shape society as they liked. But I think that is not true at all. I think in many areas they were, just as in Java, there was a lot of negotiation going on. They had to do with a lot of power structures locally, even if they wanted to change things. So I'm wondering, so you're presenting Deli as a sort of generic or a general example. I think it's a very specific example. in time. So maybe that is something we can talk about, what the example of Deli exactly tells us. How special was it as a space where experimentation was going on? And I think you're absolutely right that what they created there was a dwanggemeenschap, a community of force, and so they could actually control and experiment in terms of hygiene. So it's more in the way you're framing it than in what you're telling us that I have questions. And the same, so then from the terra nullius and from Deli, you make a shift to the city and to the municipalities. And you talk about the Tillema's visions there, which I think if we have time, it would be nice if you could give us some more concrete examples about what Tillema envisions concretely in terms of hygiene improvement. So then, and then you make, what I find fascinating is that connection that you make between the politics of hygiene here and visions of race. And this particular vision of Tillema of an improvement of the human race in general, rather than focusing or differentiating between races. And I do wonder, of course, Tillema is one person. Could we find, I mean, how exceptional was he in this view? Do you have an idea about this? And then my last point, or the last question, then goes to the third step you make about tropical colonization of, again, outer islands. So you're giving the example of Papua, and you're assuming that these are also going to be urban settlements. But my impression was that these tropical colonizations were also focusing on farming, creating plantations, clearing land. So I'm not sure whether urbanization was the aim there. So I'm not sure how that exactly fits into your story. And then finally, I think so the terra nullius, a bit more about Tillema and the tropical colonization, those were the 3 points. But then I think in general, what I really like about your paper is that you bring about this tension between what colonialism wants to do. It wants to earn money, right? It wants to benefit from, in this case, Indonesia, from the land and from its people. And at the same time, there's some, in that process, they want to create improvement to maybe to also improve the colonial situation and to improve the colonial gains. But then what colonialism does is something different, it turns out. So, and I think that is something that you discussed as well, that there is this lack of commitment. So on the one hand, they propagate this ideology of hygiene and of improvement. But then in practice, they signify the problem. The problem is the kampong. But then what do? They leave the kampong aside, because what colonialism wants, they want to make profit, and profit just isn't made in the kampong. So I think that tension is something that you illustrate very well. And I guess the legacy of the tension, I think it's really good that you're also bringing that into the paper. And I'm also curious where the research then is heading in the future. So maybe you can give us a few hints there as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Do I answer directly, Alex?
Yes, that would seem yeah, good
Okay.
right now. Yeah.
Great. So thank you very much, Alicia, for these very perceptive questions and very hard ones. Yes, I guess I I think I have to agree with you that perhaps maybe telenovelas would not be the most it was actually based on readings of what happened in the context of Australia and America. So it was a part of the discussion. But I think in my paper I would then discuss about to what extent we can then think of this as telenovelas or not. Because on the one hand, yes, it's true that telenovelas is a legal term to sort of legitimate takeover of native society. But on the other hand, there's a lot of similarities in the way that Deli was implemented, in a way that the Malay and the Batak were sort of taken off the land, and a new society was taken over. So it is. So in that case, but definitely I would have to then discuss my position in that context. But it's part of the discussion on how to understand whether this was part of separate society, I guess, within that context. Well, concretely on our second question on Philema's idea of hygiene, yes, he discussed a lot on. So he focuses a lot on actually women's health, child's health, family health. So actually a lot of these things that would later on continue in the post-colonial period, the idea that the state has the requirement to uplift at the individual level or at least at the family level. So he discussed deeply on the kinds of, and of course he's focused much more on reproduction. The idea that that there's a healthy reproduction and there's an unhealthy reproduction. And he looks at like all these societies around the world that have industrialized, that reduce their reproductive capacity. So he was looking at, okay, so we have to understand anthropologically Indonesian societies, all these various societies, and then develop means of making healthy women, healthy children, healthy. So in that sense, it does seem very modern actually when I read him, in a way that it, I mean, it would then, I would imagine, like would be reproduced in the context of the New Order, Keluarga Berencana, the family planning kind of, or stuff like that. So it's, yeah, it's but he looks at it that the municipalities should be the one to conduct this. Yeah, and the third question on tropical colonize. So let me just, I forgot about so it's about the outer island and Java, right? And yeah, I mean, obviously, I think, of course, the in Java they had a lot of what do you call that? They also conduct a lot of innovative stuff, but in the context of hygiene, I guess the context is that it occurred within dwanggemeenschap instead of vrije gemeenschap. And maybe that might be a more better idea of the vision. But the idea was that Javanese society or Java were mostly vrije gemeenschap. So in Java itself, of course, there were military. So the Camille word was the dwanggemeenschap. But if you look at like a lot of the development of hygienic healthcare system, it occurred in Sumatra in the context of dwanggemeenschap, whether in the form of like the military campaigns, like Beri-Beri was by Aikman, right? Or also in the context of Delhi, so plantation colonies. So again, maybe that's it was too broad and too of a statement and too bold of a statement. But in my paper I will definitely make it less bold. But I guess and it's really rooted in the discussions among the doctors themselves. And of course, they don't actually divide it between Java and the outer island. Actually, they do divide it between the dwanggemeenschap and the vrije gemeenschap. So that's, I guess, probably that's where I should stress this more. And I guess I haven't done so the paper is not finished yet. So it's still on the. Yeah, and I think you're very correct on the context of colonial tension. That it doesn't. What I'm really what motivated me initially for this paper was actually I was doing a work on municipal citizenship, or the idea of being citizens of the municipality, and the division between like middle class versus the company. This is something which is very much present today, right, in these societies, and it's politically it appears politically, and so you can imagine, for instance, the Jakarta gubernatorial race, the last one. It was in a way division between kampung versus middle class. So my idea was to look at this kind of the development of sort of a biological citizenship and a modern citizenship within the municipalities, in understanding whether they continued on after independence. And so it's a sort of post-colonial ideology that continued, that is believed. So the division between kampung remains, and it may explain why a lot of Indonesian cities are dysfunctional in that level because of this problem with the way municipal citizenship developed in the colonial period. So, but that's definitely not something I can conclude or anything. But that was part of the, and actually initially that was the thrust of the paper. But just so much of this ideas on hygiene came up that I thought I should definitely look up what Deli was about, because people in the municipalities were also talking about the Deli Miracle. So going through that, then I could see that it's a longer process, and then and then I sort of take it wider and take it on the whole of capitalism. But yeah, I think it just makes it very interesting because it's part of that kind of differential relationship as a result of the expansion of European capitalism in the context of Netherlands Indies colonialism. Thank you. Alicia.
Just add one question, Abi. So you're framing it as a capitalist development, but suddenly I have to think of the mission stations, where I think hygiene and bodily hygiene is very much part of the Protestant message as well, and also and Catholic, and their attempts to create a community, Christian communities in, again, outer islands. So how does that fit in? Just curious. How would that then fit in? Yeah.
Well, well, because the idea was that the expansion of capitalism, the expansion of capitalism is facilitated when you can expand people with similar culture, right? Because the idea was that it's, what do you call that, transaction cost is tinier as a result, right? And so there's always since the beginning, the export of culture, for instance, in the Americas, has been a central part of, and so it's part of that kind of facilitation. Now, obviously, that means I'm reducing the autonomous agency of religion as a. That's true, but I think in a lot of ways, it's within that wider capitalist system that the expansion of missionaries occur, or within the context of imperialism. So yeah, so definitely we would have to just the discussion on capitalism would have to be expanded. Because I'm just looking at, because again, at the end, why these kind of expansion can occur is because the capital system allowed for economically feasible expansion, right? And so, in the context of the Netherlands Indies, yes, there were various forms. There was military expansion, the state. There was missionary expansion. There was also then there was capital, and then of course, if you look at like Tillema, he advocated not as a capitalist project, but as a human project, as a nationalist project, as expression of Dutch nationalism to sort of create a form of national colonial nationalism based on hygienic health. In that sense, then yes, it's much more complicated. But the failure, I think, of that vision is again then it's related to capitalism again, right? That it doesn't really make money if you push it in that direction. I hope that answers, or maybe not.
All right. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think we could continue this discussion, but we also have to move on to open the floor, everybody, for comments and questions, for which we have around 7 minutes. All right. Are there any questions, other questions and comments? If nobody has a question right now, I was wondering about something. You mentioned during the late colonial period, there was the idea of a reproductive, autonomous European urban society. You mentioned Bandung in this regard, and that this concept ran awry with the kampung and what should be done with the kampung. But what then exactly were actually the ideas that these Dutch colonial thinkers, these officials, had about the kampung with regards to hygiene and genetic hygiene? Because even if their ideas did not materialize, it is interesting to see their mentality about the people in the kampung and what were actually their visions with regards to these kampungs.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex. Yeah, so there's actually a lot of literature on the discussion on the kampung within the municipality movement. They had two major conferences in 1922 and 25, and both of them discussed on either people's housing or the kampung problem specifically. So the problem, I think, is that within the municipality movement, the kampung, because they're within Adat society, within the Adat law of the Netherlands Indies, they're autonomous. So the jurisdiction of the municipality doesn't go into the kampung. So a lot of the discussion on the kampung were discussed in a way to show to the people that the kampung were not Adat societies, that they lost their traditional values. So they made a specific division between the desa versus the kampung. The desa were the healthy Indonesians, and it's very also Tillema's idea that once you get into the city, you lose all of your fitness, cultural fitness, genetic fitness, and within in the kampung, people lost that. Indonesians lost that, so they became degenerate, right? So they became degenerate, and their health, their conditions. So if you're living in the desa, then you're relatively healthy. Your genetic, you have the idea, but in the kampungs, you don't know that. You've lost your ability of, and so a lot of the discussions on the kampung was to convince the government to that the municipalities should take over the kampung and lose its status as an adat. And for obvious reasons, it was actually for genetic, for hygiene and so forth. But so this is another problem, is that municipalities were semi-decentralized areas within the colony, whereas the colonial state, especially in Java, was traditionally within part of that plantation society, right? In which the state traditionally are conservative. They don't want things to change too much. But the municipalities were very modern. They had a developmentalist goals. In that sense, the Dutch East India states often accuse municipalities of being nothing more than a front for capitalist penetration. So they want to exploit the Indonesians within the cities. And so the discussion is broader than, so there is no one, so there's on the municipalities as a different level than the state, than the Binnenlandsbestuur. And so for the Binnenlandsbestuur, their main goal is to preserve native society. But for a lot of the municipality, the idea was to, but at the end of the day, they weren't willing to spend the money on it anyway. So it's not, so the discussions, and it's something which I'm still gathering. So I'm reading up on a lot of the discussions on the kampung, and hopefully I'll,
Right.
I think it's what's interesting is probably it doesn't reach the kind of level that Tillema did. Tillema was very high up there. He was talking about improving society in general on a civilizational level. Yeah.
What would interest me is also you mentioned that the idea was that in the kampung people degenerate, whereas in the desa, I guess they would remain more pure. That was their idea. But did this mirror their idea about the European context? Was there also this idea that in the slums of European cities, which maybe you can compare to kampungs, people degenerate genetically, and in the villages it remained more pure? Because then that would give a more colonial context to your subject. Then we know what was the European concept and what was the colonial context.
Yeah, no, that's true. Like Tillema talked about the kampung, the Krotenwijk also in Europe, right? In which there's a degeneration, but in Tillema's mind, everyone was degenerated. I think what's very different in the context of municipalities in the Netherlands, Indies, is that almost all the Europeans at least saw themselves within this bubble of middle classness. So the middenstand, and they were very important component within municipalities. So and middle class people had different. So the idea, for instance, when they talk about the kampung is degenerating, but the Europeans, they were coming in and they were creating society. So Indonesians were losing society, Europeans were creating society. And so they were importing all these European institutions to create like a livable city. But this is something which the Indonesians aren't able to because they're in the kampung, they're not.
So, all right. Very interesting.
And what's interesting for me is that these kind of ideas, notions continued on after independence. This snootiness of the middle class Indonesians in the cities bear a lot of resemblance with that of the colonial society. And at least that was what initially was what I wanted to investigate, actually. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Looking at the time, we maybe have a room for one more question, and then we have to move on to the next session. So is there anybody with a final question or remark? If not, Alicia.
Just in the discussion just now on reflection on what's happening in Europe at the same time, or just somewhat earlier maybe than in Indonesia, in the Indonesian cities. I just had to think of the role of women in European cities and the role of European middle-class women in creating new hygienic standards, in organizing humanitarian missions into the Grottenwijken. And I'm just curious whether you can reflect on that from the Indonesian point of view.
I think that's within European women in the cities. There was a lot of, but also I think maybe even middle-class Indonesians, they were all sort of becoming this kind of, this European culture or urban culture, which cares about these. I mean, and you can, for instance, read the book by Katarina van der Meijden, who was like a how to do guide for new ladies coming into the Indies. So various rules of everything within the household, and so. So there, but societies but urban society was changing so fast at the time. I remember this one letter in a Bandung magazine saying, "Oh, now we can't tell the difference between Bandung and European cities anymore. Everything is becoming so much more Europeanized, and you don't really fear anymore." So the idea that going to the Indies before then was that you were like, people were more afraid of going to the Indies than to America or to Russia or to other places, right? The idea is that you were going to the moon. It's so biologically different, and it's so dangerous that you sort of also think that, oh, you may never see them again. But that's also changing very much, because once you reach the cities was as modern, or at least they claim to be as modern as Dutch cities in the Netherlands. So this but it's very central, the middle class lifestyle within this within the family, because the core idea of urban citizenship was that nuclear family, right? And and so in that regard, women, at least I can see like a lot of writings of women that would argue that, oh, things are much more Europeanized now. And so they probably did have significant, it's something which I haven't really delved deeper into, but yeah, they probably did have a significant role in reproducing Europeanized culture in urban societies. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Also, one thing, sorry, at the time, what's very important was that tourism was becoming a major industry in these cities. So yeah, so it's this lifestyle, middle class lifestyle, was very much connected to both hygiene but also to citizenship. This new kind of citizenship based on culture in these cities. Well, thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Farabi. It was very interesting. Yeah, but looking at the time, we reached the end of this session. You get a round of digital applause from all of us. Very interesting. Yes, let's move on to Dr. Abdul Wahid and his paper on cultural imperialism at work, the adoption of Jawi in colonial publications in the end of the 19th century. And it would be nice if you can also first shortly introduce yourself before delving into your subjects.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex. Well, my name is Abdul Wahid. I'm also working here in the Department of History. And I was also a graduate from Leiden University in the same batch with Farabi Fakih and Compass program under the auspices of Alicia. So Alicia is our teacher actually. But I moved to Utrecht for my PhD. And I finished my PhD in 2013. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizer, I think in this regard, Pak Margono, who asked me to join this workshop, this symposium. Despite it is really very short notice for me, and I'm, to be honest, a bit nervous or what to present here. And looking at especially the topic, I have several. Sorry, I have some paper of working in progress, which is not really finished, and I think that maybe I pick one of them, which is now I'm trying to present it here. And I have to admit, this is the most unprepared paper that I had, but that's the very reasons why I'm presenting here, because I really need feedback from you all, maybe especially from Philip. You are becoming my discussion. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint here. Is it already there? Can you see my PowerPoint already?
Yep.
Okay, so let's start from the beginning. So yeah, this is the title of my paper. Actually, I did research actually 2 years ago under the scheme of Department of History research grant. Sorry, Faculty of Cultural Science research grant. So it's annual research grant that we receive from the faculty, and I choose this topic. It should be a cultural imperialism at work, still a big question mark because I'm not sure. So the adoption of Jawi in colonial publications in the end of 19th century. Sorry for the typo. So I would start with some definitions because maybe well, I'm sure most of you have already known what is Jawi, what Jawi is actually. So by definitions, it is Jawi etymologically come from the word. It's from Arabic Jawa. That's what I learned from literature, which means Javanese. And the term has been used to call the Javanese and other people from Islamic region, especially Southeast Asia, and especially Jawa, who settled temporarily in Makkah, first for doing Hajj, but then later on also studying Islam. So the community of Jawi, it's basically that's the word it's referring to. So the community of Muslim community who are settling temporarily in Mecca for doing Hajj, but also for learning Islam. But according to some literature, it is also related to another word, al-jaw, meaning wind, to refer to the lands below the winds in Anthony Reid's meaning. So it's the origin of these people, the Southeast Asian archipelagic, basically. But terminologically, Jawi is a term to mention or to refer to an Arabic script which used to write Malays and other vernacular language in Malay words in Nusantara, such as Echinese, Minangkabau, Javanese, Ternate. Well, in the Japanese, we know the word Pegon, for example, to call these scripts, these writing traditions. And yeah, it's very clear that Jawi has been considered as an Arabic and Islamic influence in Nusantara. A little bit about history of Jawi, well, but maybe I should also mention about why I'm taking this issue or taking this research, because really starting from the current development in Indonesia, that we already adopted Indonesia, Bahasa Indonesia as our language, our national language. And as you know, maybe Bahasa Indonesia, or it's having its root to the Malays. And Jawi basically is the writing system of this Malay language. But when Indonesia become independent, actually, Jawi is disappear, and it's no longer recognized as part of the part of the original part of Malays, for example. And it's just become like very specific people who are still learning this, especially in the Islamic community. But anyway, I'm going back to the slide. This is the history of Jawi a little bit. So it is still unknown when exactly Jawi began to develop in Nusantara, but it is certainly has to do with the Islamization process and the introduction of Arabic in these regions. But there was surprisingly, not really interestingly, as a lingua franca, the language of trade, Malay has become a language trade in this area even before Islam, pre-Islamic period, but also pre-European period, and in Nusantara. And Malay didn't have her own script and writing system, and this is still debatable, and I don't really find really satisfying explanation why later Malays adopted Arabic script as a writing system to write Malays. So actually in Nusantara, there are several writing systems already there. Of course, Sanskrit, but also in Galigo, for example, in Bugis, but also in Batak, in Bali. But Malays, I mean, which is then considered as lingua franca, it doesn't have its own writing system. So, but then later on, it adopted Arabic script to write it, to be her writing system. So Jawi script, according to some expert, was developing along with the institutionalization of Islam and the production of religious texts and manuscript. And this is very much produced or by Islamic scholar, but also Islamists, those who are really studying Islam. Some people already, I mentioned here, for example, the Kaspari say that Jawi manuscript was produced since 1500 before in the Common Era, but also Ronkel, which argues that it began since early 16th Common Era. Malaysian historians say the oldest Jawi manuscript, Bahrul Lahut, written in 12th century. So that's a glimpse of history of Jawi as a writing system. Sorry. The cultural position of Jawi, of course, it's very important position later on, because then Malay has become a lingua franca in Nusantara, and Jawi has become a writing system of its language. So basically, it's gradually become the writing system of many people in different areas in Nusantara. And Jawi script was increasingly used by local society in different parts of Nusantara for various activities. Of course, religious activities is very prominent here, especially among Islamic community, for learning process, for the learning activities, teaching intellectual works, for example, in writing and producing the so-called kitab kuning or yellow books. It's about books written by Islamic scholar about Islamic teachings with many periods of its aspect. But also it was used in socio-economic activities. For example, I find some traveling note, diary, trading record, but also contract using Jawi. And then also diplomatic or political correspondence. It was plenty actually, and I'm sure Alex or maybe or Peter, you have encountered maybe in your documents there are some letters sent by local kings or in several area using Jawi or this Jawi writing system in their letters. But also state administrations, local kingdom state, but later also by colonial state. So that's the important positions of this Jawi system. So my questions actually is very simple. I just want to know, why did colonial government adopt or use JavaScript in their official publications? What I mean with the colonial publication is books or anything published, printed, published for administrative reasons. I will show you what kind of books that, and then what kind of documents, public applications are there, what were the reason, objective of the policy, and then the most important thing, which is I'm still struggling to answer, is what were the consequences of those publications to the existence position of Jawi in Nusantara and also to the script of Nusantara in general. But that's very general. I'm becoming more interesting to know about this after I read Ronit Rich's article in Itinerario, which is argue basically, or maybe her book also. Script is basically a site of culture and religious and also power relations, and it is very important to understand it. When we try to understand it, we need to reveal the cultural world around it, the script world. She said it's script world of it. And then of course with other scholars like Edward Said, that's about Western cultural strategy to understand, but then that's also to control Eastern world. And to what extent maybe it's the colonial mindset and epistemology, and what Laura Storro has mentioned in her book also can be found in this policy, for example. So yeah, that's basically my intentions to write this paper. And then the practical reason also because I myself encounter quite plenty of documents. By the way, I'm writing I was writing my PG thesis about the colonial taxations and the policy of colonial taxation. Surprisingly, I didn't really expect to find, for example, several documents written in Jawi. It's about the guidance of tax collecting among indigenous elite, etc., etc. I'll show you later. And how to do this? I'm trying to select some so-called maybe corpus as an example of those publications. I will show you later. So it is in the early period. I can say that when the Dutch coming, when European came to Nusantara or to Java, especially, they already find out that local people have already their own writing system or their own language, of course, and then and they hope they don't really have a choice actually, so they need to communicate or negotiate, but mastering the language of their of these people. And of course, in that context, for example, the role of interpreters, talker is very important, but also writer, clerk, etc., etc. And then another one, the stranger king, Shahbanda, for example, and colonial translator, also the Arab especially, play a very important role in several areas. And I can really see the production of trading contract, political agreement, and diplomatic correspondence, and of course mostly in Jawi, in Dutch, but some of them in Jawi, especially for the people of local, for the local kingdom or the local elite. Then usually they made contract in two language or two, three writing system, one in Dutch, the other one in local language, and then it's Malay and written in Jawi. And I move forward to the 19th century. This is the period that I'm concentrating. It's 19th century onward. I found out quite plenty of book and publications using Jawi, especially, and I suggest that the colonial governments adopt this or use this writing system and then integrate it into the very latest technology. For example, using up from lithography to the really printing, to the print and the machine. It's to strengthen their control. I mean, to persuade local people to strengthen the loyalties of local people, and also to inform the colonial government, the regulation, etc. That's why the documents can contain administrative regulations, taxation, for example. This I can show you in particular. Law system and government regulation for different localities, and policing regulations, and books. It's about books, handbook, guidance, etc., etc. Which in the 20th century, some of them are published by Fox Lecture or Balai Pustaka later on, and also some ethnographic study, ethnolinguistic, about the guidance of how to learn language, the Malay language, and the Jawi script, for example. I just want to show you some ideas about this. This is, for example, a corpus one, I call it text one. It's about tax regulations. It's this is 10, I think 15 pages document printed using lithograph and published in 1841. So it was the format is like this. So one side in Latin and the other side in Jawi. And for example, if you can really see it, this, the left side, it says that surat peraturan dari Bea Apiun di Tanah Jawa and Madura. And in the right, actually the text is similar, the content is similar, but the writing system is different. And I'm not a philologist, but I think it's very important to also to see how the writing system has changed when it comes to adopt the Dutch word. I mean, the word coming from non-local, non-Malays, because it's very different spelling, etc., etc. So surat peraturan dari Bea Apium. So this is about the regulations of how to collect opium tax in Java and Madura. And it is very much likely it was distributed only for tax collector and administrator in different localities. And then the second one is this law and government regulations. Maybe later Sanne can also give me some insight about this, because this is tax but law. The title is bahwa inilah surat aturan akan menjalankan hukum dalam residensi Borneo, bahagian sebelah barat, so it's Western Borneo, tercetak di Bandar Betawi pada percetakan Gumermen 1883. And this book, there are several versions of it, so there are especially for Ambon, Sumatra Barat, Riau resident, and this one it's for Western Borneo. So this is a handbook of how to reinforce to kind of introduce the civil law and Borneo residency, because there will be another one about the penal code or the criminal law. And I think it's from the introduction, it's very clear that it was projected. I mean, it was meant as for reading, for guidance for local administrator, colonial law administrator, but also local elite bureaucrats. And it was printed with much more advanced printing technology. And the transliterations of the Dutch, it's much more so-called standardized. I made a comparison a little bit with other books, and it's quite different from the 1841, for example, the tax regulations. And then this one, the third corpus is a policing law. And I read some of them, the content, it's about policing law, criminal law as well. So peraturan hukuman polisi buat sekalian orang bangsa Jawa dan seberang. So it's for the entire Netherlands Indies, and it was published in 1891. This is about policing regulations and criminal law for Java and the outer island. So published in 1891 to be distributed in the entire Netherlands Indies. And the intended audience was colonial, again, was colonial law, officer, police, bureaucrat, and local elite, and using much more advanced printing and using a much more standardized transliterations of the Dutch. So there's an effort to really standardize the way Dutch word are transliterated into Jawi, for example. And that's very interesting. Especially the name, it's very complicated way of transliterating.
So sorry.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, Abdul, but looking at the time, perhaps you can take a few more minutes and then
sure. Yeah.
Go to
I only have one more slide. So this is the handbook of the Malays writing system. It's published by KITV, but there is a later, much more later version, which is published by Military School of Breda. And it's meant as a kind of textbook for the training for the cadet or for the military men in that institution. So this one, it's much more like a linguistic, ethno-linguistic study. Perhaps it's also part of the ethical policy project, and that's kind of proficient for colonial bureaucrats for training of. And then so. Here it's actually about the discussion of my paper. Actually, I really want to go further on this, and I really hope to have input from you all. Actually, first, of course, the adoption of Jawi and colonial publications can be seen as a reflections of colonial pragmatism. It is because the Dutch want to embrace indigenous people. They really want to introduce their policy and gain their trust, and then they also gain their loyalty. But also maybe to certain extent also to extend the idea of belongings. I mean, citizenship, that these people, you are also part of us. You have to read this. And in the 20th century also, this kind of publication is really about very practical instructions, like how to cultivate a good paddy cultivations, and how to, and the new technology of cultivating rice, etc., etc. And to inform and implement the colonial sociopolitical agenda. Is it also, maybe this can also be seen as a kind of colonial cultural strategy, the politic of language of script. First, of course, we can really see that the knowing, the Dutch try to know it, learning it, and then adopting it in the publications, mastering it, standardizing. And then, but later on, I can really see the 20th century, they are trying to select certain versions and then abandon it. Gradually, I mean, abandon it means they introduce also Roman script through government administration, but also Western educations. New elites are mostly using Roman script, and then Jawi has been like eliminated, or not really eliminated. reduce its role in public. So along with the standing political position, Jawi was localized and then abandoned as a official script, so no longer used as a political correspondent, for example, etc. And this is very tentative. I'm still struggling to it. So what was the consequences of this? First, of course, the incorporations of Jawi into modern socio-cultural practice, integrating into printing word or printing technology. And of course, there are also studies like Nico Captain, who wrote about Said Uthman, who are also very prolific writers, Islamic scholar, produce a lot of books and using a lithograph. But that's about Islamic teaching. So it's really in the Islamic world. What I'm really saying is in the public and outside religious domain, but also in secular domain, so to say. And it's really reducing. Jawi writing tradition was localized, only practiced by Stein group after the introductions of Western educations, and for religious activities only, associated only to Muslim community, while the previous one, it was also used for different kind of purposes. And as Roman adopted as official script of administration and education, Jawi is continuously marginalized even until current period of post-colonial Indonesia. So that's why when Indonesian adopted Indonesia, of course, the strong association that Jawi is connected to Muslim, it's very much there. And I don't know, maybe whether this is really the product of this long process of how you call it, I don't know, adoption, subjugations, or whatever, and maybe we can really discuss about it. I think I came to the final part of my presentations. Thank you so much. I really hope you feedback from you all, and thank you.
All right, thank you very much. It was very interesting. A round of digital applause from all of us. Yeah, then we first move on to Philip for the comments.
All right, thank you very much, Abdul, for a very interesting presentation. And I think you showed very nicely the origins of the script. You showed very nicely how it was used and what kind of documents were used to write in Jawi. So I think that's very interesting, and I only have some questions. I think that hopefully stimulate some debate. So first of all, I was wondering, do you think that it's the case that it was possible to write on different topics and different themes in Jawi compared to the Latin script? So was it maybe possible for people on Java to write on different themes that they knew that maybe would not be understood that well by the colonial administration because they were written in Jawi? And do you also think that maybe there is some influence here of censorship? Because I know that from my own research that there was always this question of who can write, who can voice their opinion, and censorship was often very much administrated by the state to make sure that only few people could raise their voices. And I'm wondering, do you think that censorship also played a role in these publications in Jawi? Was it equally possible for the state to control these publications? And I noticed in the title that you used this word cultural imperialism. and what was the reason that the Dutch state would sort of promote this use of Jawi? Was it because maybe there were some conflicts with groups that made clear that they could not understand the text written in the Latin script, and that was the reason that they preferred to have something in Jawi? So why cultural imperialism? That implies to me that the state actively promoted the use of Jawi, and I'm wondering, like, why was that the case? And then I also have a question on the colonial administration, because I can imagine that it was very difficult maybe for these incoming administrators to learn Jawi. So I'm wondering who sort of made that process possible. Were there teachers for Jawi, or were there all kinds of intermediaries who enabled them to sort of make a transcription into Jawi? And do you think that when we are talking about this difference between the Latin script and Jawi? Is it just a matter of transcription, or do we also see that sometimes different words were used to convey the meaning of legal concepts or political concept or cultural concepts? So maybe that because of the use of Jawi, different ideas about sovereignty, about power, about authority had to be used. And would that also mean then that these concepts would relate, for example, to Islamic theology in a way that text written in Latin would not? Yeah, I have some more questions, but I think those are the most important ones. So basically, was there a different way of using Jawi? So was there maybe different kinds of censorship? Why did the state use Jawi, and why do you think it's a notion of cultural imperialism? And did Jawi also imply different words and different meanings? I think those three themes cover the majority of my questions. So thank you again for your very interesting talk, and it was very enlightening for me to see how you do your research and also connect it to language and power. I think that's a very interesting combination.
Well, thank you, Philip, for the questions. I'm not really sure I can answering all of your questions because I myself still struggling. Actually, I'm really trying to know what kind of documents can really answering for this. That's quite because your question is actually my question as well. But I'm trying to maybe to share with you my struggle here. So of course, as I said before the coming of Europe, Jawi it has been practiced by local people as a writing system for their daily lives, notably in religious aspect, for example, because the learning process or the educational institutions in the early, prior to the coming of Europe, it's very much connected to the religious institutions. Maybe that's one. And but the second, as the majority of, I can really say it's the only writing system there, because as I said, people in different part of Java especially, they use this language for their own language. Sundanese people in western part of Java using similar kind of Jawi for writing their own Sundanese language. So did the Javanese in Central Java and maybe Eastern Java, and also Maduris, they also used it for their own purposes, and they're writing it for not only for religious action. I'm sure there are also some way of, purposes for that. When I'm doing research together with my supervisor, for example, Jan Lauten Panzanan in Utrecht, he really asked me to explain why literacy in Lampung, for example, is very high. Mas Agus can also explain it at the time. And apparently, the people in that area, they use literacy. Literacy meaning it's not Latin, right? The use of writing anything. In this area, there's a traditions that young people postpone their marriage until the man is happily settled. And so, but they still keep contacting and have a relationship with their girlfriend or whatever, and use letter for communications. And most of the letter written in Jawi, for example. That's what I heard, and it is very important. So as I said, local people use this we call it Jawi for very different kind of purposes. But of course, there's another big question: how many people actually literate or can write in that period, of course, and that's still a big question. And I think as far as a religious scholar or maybe religious student, they can write because this kind of Jawi it's used in the process of learning, teaching and learning in pesantren, for example, and it still does until today in Indonesia, but gradually it's also abandoned. Sorry. And then, so yeah, that's for example, another purpose of using, or another activities that people do for using Jawi. When it comes to the questions of why the state using it, adopted it, as I said, I said it's because for very pragmatic reasons. That's the only language, not language, the only writing system. Sorry, not that only. That's the majority people write in this writing system. So that's why the government, the Dutch government, they thought that it would be they had to use this script to inform the policy, their policy, to inform their laws, their regulations, etc., etc. That's why these books, it's penal books, a police law system, and then tax collecting regulation. It's also in this. It is, for me, it's reflecting really, like perhaps maybe dilemma in one way, but also the very pragmatic nature of the colonial government and colonial system. So they have no way to do that. While maybe it's too expensive to create a local bureaucrat, local colonial bureaucrat, I mean, and also it takes time to do that. For example, sending them into school or creating a kind of special training for that, and they should write in them. For that reason, your questions about agency, who actually involved in the process, transliterating it, it's really very relevant. And I don't know the answer yet. I mean, it could be somewhere. For example, in 1970s, there are efforts from the government to recruit the religious teacher, religious advisor, religious, for example, hulu balang, penghulu. It's those who are really conducted the daily basis Islamic teaching, Islamic law for marriage, for family things, and something like that. And these people are literate. They can read, of course. They can write, of course. At least in this writing system. So I can imagine these people are also involved in the process. So I didn't find yet, for example, an evidence of, for example, the government really recruited someone for doing transliterations, for example, or translations. And there are some news about translator, even back to the VOC period. But maybe you know more than I do. Please inform me if you find a good study or good books about it. And maybe also Sanne, you can help me out here and finding how, for example, this transliterations process, who actually involved from, there must be someone from this community who helped this process or to support the process. And you can imagine that they use new technology of printing. There must be another process. Earlier, they used lithograph, which is a very traditional way of printing. And then they use a much more modern technology of printing, and then it's become a really books bundle, and then like another books, which is nice, very nice colonial books, thick with much decoration here and there. And then so it's that's why I'm really interested to start this research. It must be a very huge thing about this. There's some process here and there that I don't know yet how and where to go. I'm trying to find out, for example, because my focus is 19th century. Stadspad, for example. There are some Stadspad about Landsdrukkerij, for example, but it doesn't really tell about how the process is. It's just regulations about the finance and then official and so. Maybe my exploration is needed to explain more.
Yeah, it's very interesting, but maybe we can also open the floor for discussion and comments. But because
can I say something about different word, because Philip asking the question.
Sure.
Is there a different word when the translation took place? Yes, there's a lot. That's why when I even like translating name from Dutch name to Jawi, it's very difficult. So I'm teaching this classical Malay and this. So the students are coming from Arabic department mostly, but I give them this text to them. Can you read it? They cannot read it at all. Okay, so what kind of language this? And then especially the writing of names, for example, and then concept, Satsblad, strategy, things like that, which is unknown in the how you call it? Local dictionary, perhaps.
Yeah, very interesting.
Very interesting. Thank you for these questions and comments. And now let's open the floor for discussion, because perhaps some of the other participants do have an answer or indication to how you can answer your questions. So are there any questions or comments?
Me, Alex Margono. Hello, Alex. Me.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Mas Fakih. It's a very interesting presentation. Maybe it's good to have a kind of comparison with the Japanese scripts that also used by the Dutch colonial government for the formal publication, or whether it's in the books, handbooks, or either in the laws and regulations and any kind of Dutch government publication. They also use Japanese language. Perhaps because sometimes it's not a matter how many people use it and understand the script, but it is more for the government, perhaps because mostly the one who mastered on these scripts is somebody who mostly elite, somebody who has a power, who has a power to to spread the to read, and then in the end of the day, is what they expecting is that the message that conveys in the whether it's law, whether it's books, reach the mostly the people. And if you also realize that most of the people master on this Jawi is a teacher in the pesantrens and also elites of the local governments, native government, something like that. So they have a power to to spread the idea orally. It's not necessarily with at the same writings characters, but there's also they can do it orally to the people about the contents of the Dutch campaign on certain aspect through these languages, through these scripts. And what is also interesting is that the standardizations, the Dutch also do the same with Japanese language. They standardize, and even they try also to, at the end, make a printing machine that produce this kind of, so they can produce massively. But what is interesting, the question is that why the Jawi script, Japanese script, never be given in the Dutch colonial schools. They give only in the Dutch language also, and Latin, Romance, but not giving lesson or on this kind of scripts. So it means that the Dutch government want to let alone the teacher, the local people, to teach this kind of script for them. So and for the post-colonial theory perspective, perhaps then this is to differentiate between the government and the native and the subject of colonial subject. This is your letters. You have a responsibility to teach your people with these scripts, and my responsibility is on Roman script and Dutch language, something like that. So that's a short comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, do you want to respond, or does if not, we can move on to Alicia's question.
You collect questions.
I can respond very briefly to what Margono said. I think, thank you. Comparisons indeed with the Japanese is very crucial, and I think it's very much true. I agree with that. And in fact, actually, as I said, part of the Jawi traditions already also merged into Javanese, the so-called pagan, but this is also among the pesantren people. And they also try to use the machine, etc. There is one temptation that I really want to say it, but I don't really dare yet to say it. So there is, I think Islamic politics play a role here. I mean, the strong connections, this script with the Arabics and then with the Islamic teaching, it's also, maybe that's a problem. I don't know, but maybe I'm wrong with that, but I don't want to come to that to that aspect yet, because people from like Islamists will take it as well. Look, this is the proof of the evidence the colonialism really marginalizing Islamic people. No, but I really want to also maybe another question. Maybe we can discuss later with Pak Margono. When the modern Javanese teaching, even until today, pagan doesn't really consider as part of the Japanese traditions, which is very weird. Large number of books, and even like Babat Diponegoro, Babat, it's written in Jawi, but the Japanese, they only use Hanacaraka, that's the Sanskrit legacy as the. That's also the case for the Sundanese, and I thought that this is the product of standardization, the product of Fox lecture later on, because they produce grammar, produce and then teach in school, etc., etc., and let this popular, maybe it's comparable to the so-called the Pasar, Malayu Pasar, the Chinese Malay speaking language, which is also disappear. The difference is that the Chinese have their own media, have their own newspaper, but people using this Jawi doesn't have it, didn't have it yet. I mean, so they struggle. Another thing, among the Arabic people, they don't really see this is also a good thing. They're degrading Arabic. So, for example, those who are really with the modernization process, the Islamic modernization, for example, they see that, oh, this is the Jawi thing is not really pure. So when it comes with the purity again, Abi mentioned about purity, they should come back to the Arabic. And yeah, that's the dilemma. That's not a story, previous story. But thank you for the response, for the input.
Right. Thank you very much. Yeah, looking at the time, I think we have time for one more question, because then yeah, a break is really needed. So Alicia, you had a question?
Can I have a comment from Sanne? I just want to hear.
I do have comments, but I don't. We can also maybe collect quickly Alicia and mine question, and I'll talk really quickly.
Yeah, good idea.
Okay. Yeah, Wahid, I really enjoy your presentation. I'm very interested in this. And so just, I was wondering, maybe, I don't know if you have an answer to this, but like when I looked at the handbook for the civil law and you said that it was translated for several islands, is there like a difference in the Jawi they use for different islands, or was there sort of a generic translation for those kinds of handbooks? And that might also give a clue of like, was this one person who translated this, or would they always ask like a local translator to do the work? And I'm very interested in the same period, and I also I've only found one name of a translator, but that was to a different language. But I was thinking maybe because I do know, I've seen like that someone who works for a department for Inlandse Zaken who do translations in Batavia. So I don't know if, for example, the Regeringsalmanak would list names of people who work there. And sometimes even for Baal, it says something about who is attending certain meetings, but I don't really have solutions. But yeah, it will be interesting to know who translated it, and was there like regional differences in the like of similar text in the kind of Jawi.
Should I quickly ask my question, and then if I may? So thanks, Wahid. Also, I really enjoyed it. I would really encourage you to make more of this subject. I think it's something that is very much overdue. And I was, but during your talk, the examples you're giving of translation are all sort of centrally translated documents for the purpose of communication from the government to different areas and to the local population. But I wondered whether it's also possible to take a view from maybe the inside, how people who were addressing the government, maybe at a more local level, what languages were they using in their writing when they were writing a petition, for example? And the reason why I'm thinking of this is that I have this archive of the Residency archive of Semarang in mind, which I went through it very briefly with 2 years ago, and I just noticed that how many languages are present in the archive, in petitions, in legal documents. And so you find Chinese, you find Javanese, letters in Javanese, and also in Jawi and in Romanized Malay. So I thought you could maybe also look at the question of language from the other side, like how did people address, which languages were used to address the government when they filed a petition, or when they, I don't know, brought in documents as proof in their civil courts or whatever.
All right, very good, very interesting. I just have a quick final remark myself before we go to the break. As I wrote a paper about the first Malay Bible translation in Maluku, in the Dutch East Indies. And I seem to remember from the general literature, for example, J.T. Collins, that he also writes about the late 19th century Dutch colonial language policy, that under the influence of scientific racism and the scientific discourse at the end of the 19th century, that both in Europe but also in colonial areas, European scientists were looking for the core or the essence of the people in colonial countries. So they went back to an imaginary, pure language, also of Indonesians, and then picked Jawi and also tried to, in their terms, purify the language of other loanwords. So I think this scientific discourse during the 19th century could also be another angle that is important for this topic of why all of a sudden the colonial government produced certain texts in Malay Jawi script next to Roman scripts.
Sorry, Alex, who's that? J.T. Collins.
J.T. Collins, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he wrote several books and articles on the development of Malay.
Sure.
Yes, but as we already are over time a bit, I would propose we take a 15-minute break until 2 o'clock. And thank you very much, Abdul, for your very interesting presentation. Again, a digital round of applause from all of us. Yes, let's have a break for 15 minutes. All right, see you soon.
Okay, see you in a minute. Bye-bye.
Jadi kita istirahat sejenak teman-teman, 15 menit lagi kita kembali ke presentasi yang ketiga. Selamat menikmati kopi kalau punya, bikin kopi sendiri.
All right. If everybody's back from this short break and got some coffee or tea or other refreshments, then we can move on to the third session of Dr. Agus Suwignyo. Maybe this time I will be a little bit more strict with the time for which I made a paper. This is when there's 1 minute left, and this is when there's 5 minutes left, just because we're all in different time zones and we don't want to create problems for anybody's schedules by being overtime too much. Yes, Agus, if you're ready, we can go to your presentation. And also it would be nice if you first shortly introduce yourself. So your background, your topic, and then we can move on to the presentation. Is Dr. Agus there? Or perhaps still taking a break? Does anybody have information on the whereabouts of Dr. Agus Suwignyo?
There he is.
I think he's here.
Ah, right. Very good.
Just him. Sorry.
Oh, no problem. No problem at all. Yes, we already started. I only introduced that we go to the second round today, the third session. So if you're ready, we can go to your presentation. And it would also be nice if you shortly take the time to introduce yourself. So your background.
Okay. All right.
The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizer of the symposium, Alicia and friends, and also Mas Margono here from Kecamada. It was quite last minute that I was notified, and I am not sure whether the following presentation that I'm going to do is elaborate enough to express what I have in mind, but I will start just right away. Preliminary ideas of actually my research, and then let's see what I will hear from you as some inputs for further works that I can do. Okay, let me start with the PowerPoint presentation here. So this is this. Can you already see my presentation here?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So unlike all the other presenters who spoke of the colonial period, I would like to talk about exactly in the period after the so-called post-colonial period, but whether it was a post-colonial in a sense is still debatable. This is more on the family history of Catholicism in Indonesia. What I call the maybe tentative title is Markus and Katarina, Catholic family and the making of post-colonial society in Sumatra. Exactly about 50 years after the early colonial state. So my enduring questions that I started my thinking of doing that research is, or are actually whether the breakup of the imaginary line between colonial and decolonial periods was as disruptive as the political historiography has generally indicated. And this is all way long that I have questioned myself about on the existing historiography so far. And also if the post-colonial society is continuously in the making, thus putting the so-called decolonization as elusive, then what would be the most effective way of colonial remaking in the decolonized paradigm? And this is also another question that has come to my mind for some time. And then there are some, there are some pretexts here. I have several neighbors died over the past few years, not recently, but it's, I say the generations of my parents died already for several consecutive years, and those people were actually people who resided in the my village of origin since the beginning of the development of the region. And then also there is a personal memory that I am involved in the process of development of that region as well. And then as a newly trained historian from Leiden, so came back to Jogja about 8 years ago, and I am part of the Leiden mafia here in Jogja, here in Jogja. And then I started to question myself whether what I knew from the past in my during my childhood, during my interaction with my neighbors and so on, was a kind of different platforms of post-colonialism in a sort of a politically independent situation. And then I try to recall again a lot of experiences during my childhood and how the people in a different, in a kampong mingled each other, and how all the so-called harmony and also tranquility of life, and so on, which is so romantic. But truly, this reminded me as a newly trained historian at what Buka had illustrated in his very, beautiful imagination of Java. But then, well, that is the starting point of my, curiosity and my exploration. But also, on the other hand, I find stagnated and boring historiography, to be honest, especially the Indonesian historiography. All situated or focused on the politics and the big stories of things. And I started to take a look at these, small pieces of events, and also small level interaction of people, and so on and so on. And the fifth is, I think, the very crucial point here: a bunch yet abandoned archives. Without okay, a bunch yet abandoned archives that I could find at the local, institutions. Yeah, and in Sumatra, in a very small village in the hinterland of Lampung, the province of Lampung. And then that is very, attractive and also very crucial point that made exactly all the other four points that I had talked about, start to get the reason to go on with. Yeah. Next day. So my readings then so far have shown that the emergence of the indigenous Catholic community and the works of European missionary in Indonesia have been widely studied in the frames of the colonial society and the wake of Indonesian nationalism. This is what I can conclude from the existing readings. And whether in Java, in Sumatra at large, and in Sulawesi, Lesser Sunda Islands, and the Moluccas, the existing of the Christian community, and also especially in this case, the indigenous Catholic community, was seen as an auxiliary of the colonial administration to carry out the civilization mission of the indigene. And I remember I read the special edition of Itinerario, which also portrayed this position of Catholic missionary school teachers as the cultural agent, not only in the Netherlands, Indies, but also in other parts of the former colonial areas like Latin America. And then in the case of Indonesia, then the growing political movements started to take over all the story of the historiography. And suddenly we know that there are executions of studies that focus on the Catholic communities there. provide sort of illustrations of the various social political fields of involvements. So then the switch in the historiography also brings about changes in the historiography of Catholicism, in which then the position of the Catholic community was suddenly detached from the colonial paradigm, and then it came into the, well, I say, nationalist movement and so on and so on. So on the left is a picture of a very well-known book by Jan Blanc. That is on Katholiken and then Indonesia Revolution, and that's just one of the very important sources that we can see how the historiography on the Catholicism also changes in line with the change on the political dynamics. So studies on Catholic community and the missionary can, as long as I know, be categorized in three different groups. The making of colonial society, the, well, imagined colonial society. Catholic community, Catholic family was seen as an auxiliary of the colonial state, as a bridge, let's say, between the different community groups in the Netherlands Indies. The second cluster of the studies would say that or would put Catholic community in the Indonesian nationalist movement, as I say. But the third one, the third cluster would focus almost exclusively on the church history. And that's what I can categorize here, and so far the bibliography of existing in Indonesia and Indonesian libraries and scholarships. Okay, then the political breakup between, well, say, in the Netherlands Indies and Indonesia, or you may call it from the Netherlands Indies to Indonesia, and then a transformation between the two states, then was it a dissolution of colonial society? And was it a process of the dissolution of colonial citizenship as well? Sorry. And maybe yes, as some of us might be able to find in the literature about it. But also there is a very big question on the decolonization project, right? And then we start to talk about decolonization and so on and so on. But does it work for all different aspects, or does it work for all different regions in Indonesia or different society levels, for example? The extinction of, then suddenly we see the extinction of all stories about Catholic cultural agencies, just what we could see from studies on the Catholicism during the colonial time. And then on the other hand, we see also the perspective to see the state or organizational heavy historiography, as I mentioned earlier. So here, for example, I find a very, very interesting novel, the so-called The Ballad of the Girls of Mendut. You know, Mendut is a small village close to Magelang in central Java, and this novel was written by Mangun Wijaya, an Indonesian novelist. And this novel is got a sort of a historical novel telling about the stories of small girls who went and resided in a Catholic dormitory run by Catholic nuns in Mendut. And this is just one of the illustrations of how then the Catholic families were made during the colonial time, because among these girls then there appeared several different types of colonial citizens. Some of them went to nunnery to become nuns, but many of them then got married. But the interesting thing is that their marriage was kind of arranged by the priests and sisters, because there was a dormitory for boys, located in Muntilan, and also in Central Java. So about, well, maybe 10 kilometers, 15 kilometers from Mendut, right? And there was already a study about this, right? So many, but suddenly, after the colonial time, so after Indonesian independence, this kind of imagination of the colonial imaginations about Catholic communities completely disappeared, and all the dynamics immersed in the dynamics of state making, the dynamics of Indonesianness, of nationalism, and so on and so on. I'm truly doubtful whether the change was that disruptive, right? Or that's very, very drastic change and very drastic disruption between the colonial and the post-independent period. Sorry. Yeah, okay. So I would like to provide you with some sketches. I have quite a lot of data, but at this moment I can only provide some. So a diocese in a very small village located in an area you cannot find in the Google map right now. So this is really in the hinterland of the province of Lampung. And the diocese started with a small church in 1951, a very simple church. Now it is a little bit modernized with concrete walls and also small bells and brought to the church from Breda. And also started the Dutch priest from Breda, coming to the diocese in 1955. Although this Dutch priest had arrived in Batavia in 1931. And then, but he then was stationed after being released from the Japanese camp in 1945. Then he got a chance to move to Jogja for a while and also studied some Javanese here. But in 1955, he was stationed in this diocese of Lampung, a small diocese in Lampung. And then he was only replaced by a French priest in 1982, right? And this Dutch priest got retired in 1988 and then went back to Breda, and then he spent the rest of his life in Breda, in Nanari, in Kloosterij, or what is called in Breda, and then he died in Breda and was buried in Breda as an Indonesian citizen, right? And then and the diocese started with 3 Javanese families in 1953, only to become 270 families of Javanese, Bataks, and Ogan ethnic groups in the 2000s, in the year 2000. Sorry. Okay, so the practices of the different of the life was kind of institutions and personal. From the institution level, it was the normal, let's say, the usual religious programs of the church, weekly services, Bible club, and so on and so on. It was where this is just like in many other churches. But also, but the most important thing is the community level. So there was Thursday instead of Sunday school, and the Thursday school was not done in the church center, but in the hamlet. So the priest created different teachers, different religious teachers, and then he sent the teachers to different hamlets to teach the Thursday school for the local children, right? And then monthly community gatherings, and this is very normal, and usually it was combined with the ethnic gatherings, like the Javanese Selamatan and so on, was combined with this religious activity. And then regular family visit by the priest. I think this is also quite common practice in the Netherlands, but it was practiced in the 50s by this Dutch priest, yeah, until later. Then family spots of the priest. Family spots. So that's, the priest was spotted by families for his daily consumption. So, and the priest literally eats ate from the families. And this was a program, I said, deliberately made by the priest, not so much on the need for the daily consumptions, but to increase the ties of the families to the priest. So to increase the sense of belonging, so to speak. Right. And then this is some very interesting moment that you can imagine, right? how the community was then created with a very typical Catholic yet also traditional situation that you can only imagine in some different texts produced by now I read from the 1920s text written by a Dutch anthropologist on how an ideal Christian community should be like, something like that. So in 1992, I remember there was it was a very hot day, December 26, and there was a service for the a service for the Christmas day, which was conducted only on the 26th because the priest had to go to another place on the 25th, right? And exactly at noon, the locals started to sing the Holy Night amidst in a very modest chapel made of bamboo, and then which was situated in the midst of agricultural area, which was very dry because it was a peak of dry season at the time, and then and very so there was a contrast of how the imaginations about harmony and ties, local identity and so on was created, albeit the very different actual situation that the people were experiencing, right? And then daily life inside the family, I cannot well, of course I can present very details about this, and this is actually the focus of my analysis in this point. So how the daily life inside a family was also part of the way that imagination about harmony was also being made, right? And kind of hardness of life of a family was experiencing was a gateway to situation and imagined church citizenship. And this is very, very important because then people people got a different expressions of facing of dealing with the hardness of life, right? And something like that. Okay. Okay, the making of a Catholic family, the relationship, this is what I can say so far. The relationship between the growth of the Indonesian Catholic community and the making of colonial enterprises was asymmetrical with the decolonization of the Indonesian society. So while the decolonization was seen to be started after the Indonesian independence, we might ask about whether the decolonization also started in a different aspects in the development of a Catholic family here. I think we have seen different types of decolonization. Instead of being decolonized, then the making of a new Catholic maybe colonial imagination of a family, of a society, was only started in 1950 in the case of southern Sumatra, I guess. And the colonial breakup of institutional state politics was the start of the Catholic civilization project. So, and this is contrary to what we have understood from the existing literature about the Catholic missionary in Java or in other part of Indonesia at the time, in which on the growth of the a Catholic missionary was seen as part of the colonial project. But in this area, the specific area that I would mention, this Catholic civilization project only started after, and then, but it still brought about the imagination of the colonial period, colonial time as well. Last slide I have here. The making of, in an hinterland region of Sumatra, colonial romanticism and the imaginary evangelical acculturation continued to take place until long after Indonesian independence, when the making of a Catholic family, a prototype of a post-colonial society. So my focus here is that reproduction of post-colonial society, of a colonial society in the post-colonial context would be or was actually facilitated by this project, this missionary project, without traps, yeah, without being, put as an intended, as planned. But you can see all what the similarities between what all those anthropologists and anthropologists had written in the 50s, as I mentioned, like the writings by Booker and some others, in the context of the 50s in this particular part of Sumatra, and then how the society, Catholic society, Catholic community, Catholic family comprised the whole, part of society in the area at the time. And then that is what I would like to say, that there was a sort of a continued process, and the decolonization was a state project, but then there was a different level, a different aspect, different society, different community that continued to produce a different concept, different imaginations about the society by reproduction of the past. And then, well, that's what I can say so far. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. That was very, very interesting. And again, a digital round of applause from all of us. Yes, then we go on to the commentator, which is Dr. Sanne Ravensbergen.
Yeah, thank you, Agus, for a very interesting presentation. I'm very excited to read more about your project and all the things you find. So I have 2 questions / comments that hopefully will be helpful. So first of all, you started off with basically a new approach you're suggesting, and also an approach that's only possible with new sources you're using. And if I understand it well, what you actually propose is to use a sort of micro-history of different case studies around the Catholic family. So my question there would be, because I'm really like convinced by this, but my question is then also, what can which questions can these sources exactly answer? And that's related to what I was thinking of, because you are interested in like the disruption of decolonization, and you're sort of switching between the different levels. So there seemed to be a sort of thriving of the Catholic family in the post-colonial. So you're talking then about the level of the family, but there's also the level of the church, of the organization of the church, and then there is the state level. So there's a sort of disruption on the state level, but on the level of the family and the level of the church, you actually see different developments happening that are not necessarily similar to the disruptions that take place on the state level. So I wanted to ask you if you could say maybe a little more, like in a stronger way, like where are exactly the disruptions and where are they not, or where are they actually? So I was thinking, for example, about like in the church where the changes in materials, because there was not necessarily a change in people, in priests, or in different moments than when you would expect. So what happened to like the materials or the content of the religion, and how, if we see the family level, what other processes are going on there that your sources tell you that like church sources or the state's focus sources are not telling us?
Yes, thank you very much, Sanne, for these comments. Do you want to respond, Agus, or should we maybe first collect questions from the audience and then you can respond?
Yeah, okay, maybe we can collect questions from the audience so that many other can raise. But of course, I will respond right away on the matter of the archives then later. Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, up to you. Yeah, maybe you can do it right now.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Sanne, for the two questions. The first one was, if I get it right, then you were wondering which question I can answer by which archives. Is that correct?
Yeah, so you said that the sources are very micro-historical, right? They really give us access to the family level.
Yes.
So just if you could say a little more, like what was your new finding there that surprised you compared to the sources you used before?
Okay. Yes. Something that that intrigues me so much is on the way the missionary project in the post-colonial period work on the details of the family uprising, family rising, not uprising. You know how they really guide the family, in not only in religious terms but also in the daily aspects. The daily aspects. So there was a time when weather was really bad, very hot, and no rains, and very dry, so that you cannot plant anything, technically speaking. And people started to get a problem with food availability because they could not get the cassava growing in their area, and so on and so on. And then what happened was that the priest started to make some sort of organized programs, not run by himself, not run by the church, but it was a program run by the people itself. So the people started to help each other with, so the priest was kind of organized the mutual help system that had already existed in the people value system. So that was very important. So by doing that, then the priest showed sort of a little attention exactly to the heart of the people's problem. So and he situated himself not part as a priest, but part of the people. And there was a strategy, and this is exactly, I think, one of the ethical policy proponents, right? Was it Abendanan or the opposite of Abendanan? I might have it wrong, but one of the ideas of ethical policy was one of the two main schools of ethical policy in the early 20th century was for the government to go deep into the people's life, deep into the people daily, struggles with their life, based on on their local problem, their contextual problem. And this was just a kind of what I see in the practice of the priests in this Lampung area in the 50s was a kind of representations of the ethicists of the early 20th century. Then we can see then maybe relationship about the humanistic values that both these ethicists and the priests were holding, for example. And of course, we can talk about this aspect as well. But my point is that the ideal imagination of the ethical policy, for example, was only being made in the area of this Lampung in the 50s, when other area on the national level discourse in Indonesia started to talk about decolonization. And this is something to me very striking, and then meaning that the making of the Indonesian state And the paradigm of decolonization in the 50s was not actually on the people's project. It was a real estate project, because on the other level, at the people's level, we can see something very different. And then maybe I don't know whether I am answering your question.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think it really ties into discussions we had with within Alicia's project about how where disruptions take place, when they sometimes take place in one level, they take place in a delayed way in another level, or not at all, or they're experienced in a different way. So yeah, it's really fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. But now let's open the floor for other questions and comments. So are there questions, comments for Agus? Yes, Yuda.
Yes, thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Markus. This is an interesting look into the history. You mentioned a little bit about acculturation in the families in Lampung, and I would like to hear more about that, because this sounds very exciting to me. A Javanese community, right? If I understand it correctly, are they part of the immigration program? That's my first question. And then, what kind of acculturation did you see there? I was touched by the singing of "Oh Holy Night" in this bamboo chapel. This is beautiful. But what are the other elements of cultures that are integrated? On the one hand, they're Javanese, they live in Sumatra, and then they become Christians, the way I understand that, or Roman Catholic. How do they worship? What components of the Javanese / Sumatran cultures did they integrate into their worship, their mass, their singing? Give us a little more look into that situation, please.
Alex?
Yes. Do you want to respond, or should we first collect some questions?
Okay. Okay, we collect questions, right?
Yes.
I'm just afraid I'm then taking too much of the time to answer then, but I will answer the question later.
All right.
Of course. Okay. I am taking that on the questions as well.
Very good.
Maybe
Because Alicia. Yeah, sorry. Because Alicia, I think, also had a question.
Yes, please.
In a way, my question relates to what Judith Janto was asking. I'm curious, this is a history paper, but I imagine this community still exists and you visited the community. So is this, are you also expanding your research into the present, into how these people, this community now looks back at that early history of how their community took shape? How do they look at your questions of decolonization? Is that something that you're planning to do, or are you focusing only on that 20th century history? In a way, it relates, I think, to what you guys asked.
Indeed. Are there other questions or comments? If not, then maybe Agus, you can delve into these topics.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Pak Huda, and then the initial, let's say, nucleus of this Catholic community was Javanese. As I said here, as I put in the slide, three Javanese families coming to Lampung as part of the transmigration program of the government. But then this Catholic community developed in not only to cover Javanese families, Javanese community, but also the community from the Batak people, and also the Batak people who also reside in in this region, right? And then, of course, these Batak people was very small in number compared to the Javanese. They were about maybe five to six families in 1990s. Yeah, very small in numbers, but they were part of this community altogether. And also the very surprising thing is that the local ethnic group, the Ogan, some of the Ogan families also converted into Catholicism. And so to make this community diverse in terms of ethnicities. And this is to me very, very interesting as well, because then also some studies have indicated that the Christian and Catholic communities in Lampung existed especially because of the big project of transmigration of the government. But from several observations, it is clear that also the local and other ethnic groups became Catholic or Christian, so they comprise the overall community. The acculturation, yes, right. Initially, services were conducted in Indonesian for the week for the first 3 weeks, and then the 4th week was conducted in Javanese, and sometimes they use the Javanese gamelan as well, given that the Javanese Catholic community comprise the largest, in the area. However, by the running of time, then by the time then it was there was an idea that maybe some prayer should be recited in other languages, and the Batak got this privilege because they had the what's it again, one of the I don't remember, that one of the very important prayers in the Catholic Church was then recited in the Batak language, right? And it's very important. But then, of course, the Indonesian language was the most important language in this all these establishment, right? Next, Alicia, question is very challenging. Alicia, I deliberately put a line of time to the early 2000s, because then after the fall of the new order, then maybe in the larger context would have changed to a different direction. So to make this process of post-colonial society via the works of Catholic missionary, the focus of my research, then I would specify the period until the early 2000s. So whether I would look back, I would do some interviews with the people about their history, and then that may be yes, but then to also to explore the state of the art, then would be, well, inviting a different element in my research, right? That is the so-called decentralization, the changing political context after the fall of the new order. Then that will be quite different direction then. So that is it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Agus. I think we could have continued this discussion for a very long time. There's enough subject matter to still discuss, but we have to go on, unfortunately. So you get another round of digital applause from all of us. And hopefully it was useful. Then we move on to the last session of today, dedicated to Sanne Ravensbergen. Sanne, is it... you already started your PowerPoint. Great. Yeah, maybe you can firstly short introduce yourself, and then we move on to the presentation.
sorry, that was a little too fast. Let's see. Yeah, so yeah, thank you so much, organizers of today. It has already been very interesting and inspiring. I don't think I've ever learned this much between 6 and 9 a.m. in the morning. So I will just present what I'm working on at the moment, which is also very much work in progress. So all input is very welcome. And this is my research, which is part of Alicia's research project, where we look at the development of colonial mentalities in the 18th and 19th century. And I focus on the lawyers and on the process of colonial lawmaking. And the actual process of lawmaking that happened before the ordinances were made and issued from the Office of the Governor General in Batavia. So these ordinances were very diverse, and they could range from instructions for tax forming or the issue of travel passes or criminal punishments. But what is interesting, or what I find very interesting, is that this lawmaking often arose out of local issues, local questions, problems. And the making of the ordinances was often preceded by a temporarily organized commission of inquiry. Composed of prominent colonial officials, and they would travel down to the specific locality to draw up advice. And today I will talk about one example of these commissions. So there's different kinds of commissions. There's the transition commissions, when there was like a regime change, for example, in 1803 from the VOC to the colonial state. And there were also humanitarian commissions, for example, the lesser welfare research in the early 20th century. And there were ad hoc commissions, and those were often started in case of like when there was fear of a conspiracy by local elites. So then quickly a commission was composed to research what was going on. But today I will talk about the fourth type, is the legislation commissions. And all of these commissions were often, I have come across so far, were manned by lawyers. So the example I will give today, the legislation commission, they are a little less spectacular in nature than, for example, the ad hoc commissions. Because there the reports are filled with anxiety, violence, conspiracy, and rumors. But the legislation commission reports are very fascinating to me. Because they reveal the practices and the complexities and strategies of the moment of the colonial encounter, where there's really an encounter going on between the colonizer, colonial officials, and local elites. And it really also offers insight in how Dutch lawyers and officials saw the place of local law, of custom and religion, and also language within the legal system. So today I will talk about a one-man commission, Timon Henriques der Kinderen. We see him here. And he was a prominent Dutch colonial lawyer, jurist, and he was appointed to write the colonial legislation for 17 regions in the Netherlands Indies. And we already saw in Wahid's presentation one of the handbooks that would be the result of his work. And in 1865, he decided to, after Java and Madura, to first focus on West Sumatra. So that's what I will be talking about today. And this was in a very important region for colonial profit making. So it was also important for the Dutch to have colonial legislation and a colonial court system being organized there. And it was also, in terms of law, a very complicated place because in 1833, the Dutch had promised in the Plakat Panjang, the long contract, to never change the local institutions of government and law in West Sumatra. But only 30 years later, when Der Kinderen went there, he argued that this contract had to be changed, as the Netherlands had to fulfill its obligations as a, and I quote, civilized nation. So this is all the places where Der Kinderen would travel to and write up legislation. In the case of West Sumatra, it was about the regulations for how the law courts would be organized and how criminal law would be applied. In West Sumatra itself, Der Kinderen traveled to 13 locations where he held public meetings with local leaders who were already working for and appointed by the colonial government. And the governor of Sumatra, Van der Bosse, was also attending all these meetings and did most of the talking with the local leaders. And then 10 years later, Der Kinderen comes back to West Sumatra to implement the regulations, and then he also visits many places that are listed here on the slide. So in 1865, a number of well-known names would be attending the codification meetings. Willem Iskander would act as a translator. So I was excited to hear more about the translators in Wahid's presentation, but I've only found this one name. So I found the minutes of these codification meetings so I could see who were attending the meetings. And the minutes of one of the codification meetings, so there were 13 in total, one of them, the minutes were carefully kept by a local notable attending, whose name was Sultan Sanyago, who was Imam Bonjol's son. And then someone else whose name I came across was Raden Mas Panji Adiningrat, who was a Javanese jaksa, and he would accompany Der Kinderen in 1875, so 10 years after the meetings, when the regulations were introduced and implemented in West Sumatra. So copies of the minutes of all 13 meetings were also held and stashed away, but preserved nonetheless in the colonial archives by Der Kinderen. And the minutes of the public meetings, which I found in Andri in Jakarta, were hidden in the back of a thick file with seemingly boring legal regulations and formal correspondence. And in the back were the minutes of these meetings, and it was to me a very exciting find. Because they sort of reveal the fascinating encounters between a variety of actors and voices, from local elites and although through the pen and the filter of the Dutch colonizer, because a Dutch secretary would write down the conversations that were held during the meetings. So what do these meetings mean? And at the moment, what I'm doing is basically exploring the various ways of analyzing and understanding these available sources of the codification meetings and the temporary space of law in which they were held. So here you see one page from the minutes. Some of the minutes are very long, others are more brief, and all of them are like signed by all the people who were attending. And all these meetings were held outside at a central place in town. The largest meeting had more than 80 local heads and over 10 Dutch colonial officials attending, and other meetings were somewhat smaller. So to give one example, in Siboga on May 19th in 1865, in the northern part of West Sumatra, that included the Batak regions, present were Der Kinderen, the governor Van der Bosse, the resident of Siboga, and the controleur. And they were mentioned first. And then there was a large number of local heads. There were 7 Kuria chiefs, 1 Passer chief, also mentioned all by name, and a large number of what they called lesser chiefs who were not mentioned by name. A Dutch secretary wrote down the minutes. And it's not completely clear in what language the meeting took place, but we know that Der Kinderen was not very fluent in Malay. But the draft regulations that were circulated to the local chiefs were written in Malay. And we also know that during the meetings, you can see that, for example, in this meeting, Sultan Igamo, the district chief, he spoke up at the start of the meeting. and declaring that he could read Malay, but some of the other district chiefs from the Batak regions could not, and he offered to translate for them, and you can see during the meeting that that's also happening. So this is 30 years after the Plakat Panjang, and their kinderen already knew before he arrived in West Sumatra that he would breach this contract. And it's exactly what he did. For example, by abolishing what they called the system of solidarity in criminal law. So the question is, why did their kinderen travel to West Sumatra in 1865 and held these 13 large meetings if he already knew he would basically after this introduce a completely colonial system? And what was the importance of these meetings? What happened here? Like, what kind of colonial encounter was this? So of course, I was very interested in the moments where the participants in the meetings would disagree. But it was also apparent that it is clear from the minutes that the participants in this encounter actually understood and met and agreed with each other in a number of ways. In many ways, they had shared interests, beliefs, views, and worries. So what they had in common was a few things. First of all, they were all men. And this was decision-making about, not with, women. And although in the Minangkabau, there was a matriarchal system, including like land and inheritance, but this did not mean that all power was in hands of women. Women were not welcome in these kinds of meetings, and also within the Minangkabau society, there were enough spaces that they did not have access to. And you can see this in moments when they're talking about issues like adultery and how women should be punished in those cases. There's a very lively discussion going on in that moment. Second of all, they were all bureaucrats. The local leaders attending and the Dutch officials, they were all working in a way already for the colonial government that was in place. So they all also had the responsibility to carry out a colonial legal system, but also the plantation system. They had responsibilities in this, taxes and services. So in that sense, there was a common ground to talk about the execution of the bureaucracy. For example, keeping the peace and order, talking about responsibilities of kampong chiefs. There was an open discussion about that, and there was an agency from the local leaders. Then third of all, there was the understanding that there was the religion. There is a lot of referring to the belief in one God, prayers to God without defining which God, but there is a belief in one God that the participants in the meetings are sharing. And then finally, it seems that there's a lot of language from all participants about progress and civilization, whether it's local leaders referring to their region being more civilized or more progressed than other regions or less so, or Dutch officials emphasizing the importance of Western education, or all participants being interested in education in general. So when there was one of the things that all participants had in common, there was much more space, as becomes clear from the minutes, to go in depth in the discussion and make decisions where everyone was being heard more or less. And there was room where local heads could negotiate for their own position and for better government structures, but always within the framework of the colonial state that the Dutch officials were comfortable with. Of course, very interesting in the encounter is the controversies, the moments where it became a little uncomfortable. And what's great about these sources is that you can almost feel the uncomfortable moments and also see where they would not understand each other or not wanted to understand each other. So there's many examples, but I will just talk about two issues. And Alexander, I cannot see you, so if you hold up a sign, I don't see it. So just tell me. Okay. First of all, so let me zoom in today on the issue of adat, because this was, of course, a big controversy. The promise had been made that the adat would not ever be changed by the Dutch, and this is exactly what they now wanted to do. In a short dialogue between Bagindo Saleh and Jules van der Bosse, the Dutch governor of West Sumatra, the lack of understanding or wanting to understand becomes very visible. It's June 25th of 1865 during a meeting in Prianan, and the local heads are pointing out to van der Bosse, who was a self-declared expert of Sumatran adat, that there were inconsistencies in his explanation of the existing solidarity system, in which, in case of murder, the community of the murderer was involved in payments to the community of the victim. And van der Bosse wanted to convince the meeting of his belief that the solidarity system was an infringement on what he calls the old adat, and that the abolishment of this system would therefore mean a protection of the adat. And he doesn't succeed in convincing the meeting. So then he decides on a different strategy, and he turns directly to Bagindo Saleh and he asks incredulously if he would be willing to pay for his relatives if they would commit a murder. And the Dutch clerk notes the response by Bagindo Saleh as follows. Named head answers that this would depend on the circumstances, but that he would certainly be willing to pay in certain instances. And after that, van der Bosse quickly changes the topics and he doesn't really inquire what these instances would be. And it is interesting because here the Dutch colonial officials have two different strategies or explanations. So van der Bosse emphasizes that the abolishment of, for example, the solidarity system would be a return to adat. But in other moments during the meeting, yes, in other moments during the meeting, sort of the opposite argument about adat is given. During a meeting in Ankola, the argument is given by Dutch officials that the old adat had to be changed because the region had changed and developed so much that the laws had to be adjusted to the new circumstances. And especially Der Kinderen uses adat to argue for the introduction of the colonial legislation being similar to the fluid, ever-changing nature of adat. In 1875, 10 years after the meetings, when Der Kinderen returns to West Sumatra, he visits all the same places as 10 years before to implement the new colonial legislation. And then large festivities are held with flags and dinners and games for the people and many, many speeches and prayers by Der Kinderen, local elites and Panghulus. And during the visit, the local officials are trained by the Javanese Jaksa Hadiningrat, who, as I said before, accompanies Der Kinderen. And the printed regulations are presented in 3 local languages drafted by the translators. And then Der Kinderen also refers to adat. In one of the speeches, he explicitly makes clear why he thinks it's justified that he is introducing a colonial legal system here. He's giving a speech and he's standing at the same places where the meeting was held 10 years ago. And he reminds the Sumatran leaders of the large old waringin tree that had been there. And he says, 10 years ago, we found shelter under the broad branches of this old waringin that later has fallen over. Some of you might think that the adat will be sidelined because of the new legislation. But those who say that have not thought about it long enough. Because if they did, they would understand that when a people develops more, the laws will also change. That is why in your traditions, the Hadat Nan di Hadat Kan exists next to the Hadat Nan Benar. The new laws that I now give you in name of the government are like the Hadat Nan di Hadat Kan. And then after the speech, Der Kinderen plants a new tree and the Panghulu reads a prayer. So here adat is used in two ways to argue in favor of the introduction of a colonial legal system. And then there's a second moment where I think the minutes make clear what happens in the colonial encounter related to adat. So that's the second point. On April 6, 1865, the Jaksa Datudin Negeri Rangkaya Besar in Fort de Kok, Bukit Tinggi, he asks, as he says, in name of a number of heads, what the difference is between murder and manslaughter, moord and manslag. He explains that according to the Malay adat, there are three different ways in which a person can lose his or her life due to actions of someone else. Amat, Sagbu, and Gata. Apologies if I explain this or pronounce this in the wrong way. The severity of the crime decides the punishment. Then Governor van der Bosse responds to this by saying that Dutch criminal law actually has a similar divide because there's malicious manslaughter and manslaughter caused by an accident or carelessness. Only the first one would lead to the death penalty. So in this case, the Jaksa agrees on the translation that will be in the regulations. And it will be very interesting to compare all the regulations in the different languages to see how these regulations are being translated. But there's also moments where the translation question is complicated. So there's a similar question about the bangon, which the Dutch translated as blood money. And they wanted to abolish this because it was part of the solidarity system. The Jaksa, in response to this, explained that the bangon was not the same as compensation money. But Governor van der Bosse insists that only the judge can decide if and how much compensation money the relatives of the victim would receive. And in the end, they come to sort of an agreement, according to the minutes, that the Sumatran heads who serve as judges in the colonial law courts are allowed to continue using the word bangon in practice in the courtroom, even though this would from then on refer to compensation money instead of blood money. So there's an interesting dynamic going on in this colonial encounter, because there is in fact no other outcome possible than the full introduction of the Dutch criminal law system. And there's very little to none space for negotiation on the side of the Sumatran leaders. And no attempt on the side of the Dutch officials to try to understand the Minangkabau criminal law traditions. So the suggestion of this being a meeting is being made constantly by emphasizing that everyone should ask questions, that everyone can express their criticism. But what happens is actually a discussion about the translation of existing Minangkabau legal terminology into Dutch concepts, making the earlier meaning of the Malay term disappear. Minangkabau law is being erased even more because their concepts and terms get a different meaning and content. So in this case, in the meeting, there's not so much a loss in translation, but this is a case of active erasure through translation. So to conclude, the time we're talking about, the 1860s until the 1890s, were the decades when liberalism prevailed in the colonial policy, and especially liberal lawyers dominated the colonial legal system, like their kinderen. This was not the moment of adat law, the writing down of customary law in books that would become the static archives of dynamic local legal cultures in the early 20th century, which is a heavily debated topic for legal history in Indonesia. But when I started looking into the actions of their kinderen in West Sumatra and the moment of the meetings, it turned out that custom was actually quite central to the meetings held there. And also during the implementation of the new legislation in 1875, this was apparent. And their kinderen would later on, almost immediately, but especially later by Van Vollenhoven, be criticized for ignoring the adat. And that was not unjustified. But I would actually argue that their kinderen was aware of adat. And he pretended during the meetings to partially respect it. And then he would strategically use language on adat to largely abolish it in the end. His strategy was more based on knowledge and more refined than often assumed, I think. Adat was part of the process of colonial knowledge production, because ignoring it was simply impossible, especially in West Sumatra. Their kinderen might have organized the meetings to test in what way the introduction of a colonial legal system would be possible without invoking revolt by local leaders. And by making the local leaders complicit in the meetings, because they all had to sign the minutes, their kinderen established the legitimacy he needed 10 years later when he returned to West Sumatra to impose the new regulations on the law courts and criminal law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanne. It was very, very interesting. A digital round of applause on behalf of us all. And indeed, erasure through translation also corresponds nicely with some other subjects that have been dealt with today. Yeah, let's move to the comments now from Professor Sri Margana.
Okay, thank you. It's very fascinating presentation, Dr. Sanne. I enjoy very much. In the case of West Coast Sumatra, it's always interesting because also if we compare it to Java, for instance, and the main ideas that I like from your presentation is that you want to argue Van Vollenhoven, that so far the Dutch has ignored the adat law, and from this research proof that actually at least Kinderen has take very much serious attention on the adat law before he designed a new legislation especially about the law in West Coast of Sumatra. And first that I would like to emphasize here in that usually if the Dutch has an initiative to change the law, especially Plakat Panjang, who has been decided not to be changed by the Dutch based on the 1930s agreement, but finally they changed it. And if we learn from Java, for instance, the Dutch would only change the law if the local law, the adat law, has affected to the Dutch community. So if when for the first time the Dutch came to West Coast Sumatra in 1830s, and they decided that they don't want to disturb the Dutch, the adat laws, perhaps because the Dutch community in this area was still very rare, was still very few. And then, of course, almost in 35 years, they changed the more and more people, Dutch people living in this area, and the real encounter between the Dutch society and the local society become more and more intensive. And then, of course, when they realized the fact that the local law was really what you call it as uncivilized, or you notice in the beginning that the local adat law was uncivilized, that should be civilized. I mean, that's they are worried if this kind of sanctions of the adat law will affect the Dutch colonial society. This is the first note that I would like to say to you. And then second note is that there's always an argument from the Dutch when they have things to do with the local people. When want to make a change, they was always using like uncivilized and civilized, and traditional and modern, something like that. So they use this kind of term based on their ideas, based on their perspective. So maybe this also raises a question: what is the real reason actually? The word uncivilized law is needs something to be explained here. Perhaps you find in the minutes that you find in the National Archive in Jakarta, what is the meaning of uncivilized laws in that terms. The next notes that I have here is that the language, okay, they have really attention on the other, and they gathered people, and they have a meeting with them. They make a communication. Of course, the question of language is very important here. Is there in the minutes that you find there in the archive also, you find the Malay or perhaps a local language that used in the notes or annotation of the meeting, and then the one who is there anyone who also involved in this meeting, also has very important part in the translation of the I found this in the name of Rizal, if I'm not mistaken, somebody who has been trained in the Dutch in the Netherlands at that time, and then returned to Indonesia, involved in this meeting. And then also the question of languages, there is always a debate also among whether there's a loss of translation, whether there's a good translation and understanding about that. And then it's the other thing that's important is that perhaps how much is this when they decided to change and involving people, local people, how much is the local value was really taken into account. In the case of the payment for the, what you call it, the solidarity, system of solidarity, that finally in the negotiation, the Dutch failed to convince local ruler elite and then return it to the Adat about the amount of the payment for this case, this kind of case. So how much actually the local value has been taken into account in the whole, especially in the whole aspect of the new legislation. And the last, perhaps, the abolishment of the plakat panjang, and perhaps it's not only in the plakat panjang. The most of the adat law in Indonesia, especially in Sumatra, there's always a kind of issue later, especially when Vollenhoven and Terhar has a big project on the adat law in Indonesia in the beginning of 20th century. And perhaps his main argument is only based in Java, where when the Dutch want to change the Javanese adat law, they just invite the party of Sultan or Sunan, and then discuss with the residents, and then they agree with the two of them, and then finish. And they could just decide what they want. So this is perhaps the main idea why Van Vollenhoven has said that the Dutch people, the Dutch government has ignored the Dutch law in that time. So that's all that I can note here, but it is really, really fascinating because so far we don't really understand the process of legislation by the Dutch so far and how they involve local people. And what is interesting also that they make inquiry into the field, but when they discuss the change of the legislation, they select the team of certain team, which is perhaps not involved in the the local level, in the inquiry in the field, something like that. So this is the gap between them. But I like your statement that that this is really a good criticism for Van Vollenhoven. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Margono. It's really an honor that you commented on my work, and I now already have a to-do list of all the things I have to figure out and do research on. So yeah, so to start with the last point, so I try to follow the process of what happens when you organize a meeting, and to really sort of unravel the process of knowledge making here. But I think it's a good point that, like, who sets the agenda is something I should really tease out, like what was even on the agenda, what was even possible to discuss. Yeah, so what I haven't done yet is looking at like who Van Vollenhoven and his collaborators invited as informants in this specific region, and what then the process was of gathering the information. So that would be really interesting to see like which topics were then discussed and the differences between that. And then, well, yeah, so for language, the minutes I found were in Dutch, but they were a translation of the minutes that were made in Malay before. But I've only seen the Dutch ones, except for the one that was kept by Sultan Sanyago. That one was in Malay. But I don't know. So there, because Willem Iskander is there as a translator, like during the meeting to translate in Mandeling. And he later makes the regulations also in that language. So I don't know if the minutes, if he also wrote down the minutes in that language, but I do know that the minutes were distributed through the region, that people had time to read it and then sign it, because there's a reference made where, oh, not all minutes have been returned because not everyone signed it. So there must have been, the minutes must have been there in several languages, but so far I only have the Dutch ones. But the regulations in the different languages do exist. So it would be possible to make a comparison between the final regulations in all these languages and which words they then would use for something like compensation or solidarity system. So I haven't done the comparison in language. And then your question about the references to whether something was civilized or uncivilized, I think actually this was language that Der Kinderen really used for his Dutch audience when he wrote letters, or like it was sort of language that was used a lot by the Dutch. I think during the meetings, there was not really the sense that certain laws would be more or less civilized. I think it was really like a discussion on content of law, and there was a lot of like not understanding the other system, but it was not necessarily in the meeting said that this is less civilized. But I think it's really the language of the area. So then later when he writes about it in his letters, he uses that language. What he does say is that he makes a difference, and I think Sumatran leaders do the same, between certain regions. So the Minangkabau, like the heartlands of the Minangkabau, refer to themselves as we are more developed than other regions. And I think they're often talking about the Batak. And those regions also, according to the minutes, say that about themselves. So they are making a sort of hierarchy within West Sumatra. So there is some talking there about, but it's more talking about progress. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, that was very interesting, also very elaborate. And since we're already past our time a bit, let's open the floor for discussion, but maybe refrain us to like 5 minutes. So are there questions, comments from yes.
Yeah, I think I was one of also the discussant. So I
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Sanne has 2 discussants, wasn't it? I may have read it wrong. So
All right.
in any case, I have some.
Let's make some time for that. No problem.
Okay, it's again, first of all, really fascinating studies on which looks at almost the micro level of how state formation in the 19th century in the context of law, and of course you mentioned a very interesting idea that the action of translating laws into modern Dutch legal laws, that erased its has a form of erasure. I have just some since this is not something I'm very knowledgeable about, so I have more of just general questions. I'm not sure how useful it is. And one thing I want to know is the process of consultation with local leaders. To what extent did they affected the outcome? So, the idea of participation in this is, the formation of the modern legal system. To what extent, because it seems very participatory, right? And that's one. The other question I have is, what is its effect? So once it's codified, and maybe there's something, so are there within the larger society, how do they respond to this change from adat to a codified adat, to a more modernized adat? How do wider society respond to these kind of changes? I was very interested in that you mentioned about the monotheistic discussion of one God. What function do you think that had? I was just and maybe it may be in relation to ideas of colonial citizenship or something, or why did that? Why was that an interesting thing that occurred? And maybe the last one is on. So you say Van Vollenhoven criticized significantly the conduct of these commissions, at least in particular the one in West Sumatra, as being not adat. But once he was codifying it in the 20th century, this has already happened, right? The change. So in that sense, how much can Van Vollenhoven erase the changes of the previous state-making process of the legal process? So in that sense, how much was he criticizing? How much was he actually just continuing on? Maybe just my last question is that since adat was not codified previous to modernization, to the modern state, it was much more fluid, right? As much as I understood it, the definitions and stuff were more fluid. So the process of transferring it to a modern state, institutions already changed it anyway, right? So in that case, it's not just about the translation; it's about the rise of institutions, modern state institutions that forced it to, because the logic of it had to change as well as because of the presence of these institutions. So just these kind of questions. Thank you very much, Sanne.
Thank you, Abi. Very good questions. Not all of them easy to answer, but definitely also on the to-do list. But to say something, so the process of consultation, so how does it affect the outcome? So I think it would only affect the outcome if there was some sort of interest on both sides to actually affect the outcome. So if there was definitely a very fruitful discussion about the kampong chiefs and to what extent they could actually, for example, impose punishments for very small misdeeds. So in that sense, then there was from both sides an interest in it, and then there was space and there was an actual outcome. But in the case of, I think this, what I was talking about today, like the criminal law issues, with the solidarity system, there's nothing to find that was actually, that there was basically no agency from the side of the local leaders. So then you cannot see the effect in the outcome. But you can still see that it was for a moment part of the knowledge making process, but then didn't go further. There was definitely, what's interesting, when you said once it's codified, how was the response? So it's of course very hard to find out what like the people thought who were actually, this system was imposed on, who were not leaders, who were not the judges. But Der Kinderen refers to in his report of his glorious visit to Sumatra in 1875, he refers to people, farmers, singing a song where they say, first we had adat, now we have to do services for the colonial government. So they say first we had adat, now we have herendiensten. And he saw that song as a sort of compliment for his work, but I don't think it in any way, it feels more like that it was a song that made fun of the colonial government. So yeah, so that was nice, a nice found. Yeah, the one God, I don't know, I think I always feel that religion is my blind spot. So I don't know if I'm missing something here. I read it more as also trying to find a sort of common goal where it's very explicit. It's always like there's the one God, and God is blessing this project, and then they're not talking about who this God is, but there is like one God, and whether it's Christianity or Islam, it's really used as a way to, yeah, also find understanding or but probably there's much more intelligent things to say about this that I'm missing here. So I'm looking at the religion historians here. Yeah, and I should definitely look into how much is Van Vollenhoven actually doing in this area. What can he still do? Is he trying to reverse things? Or because what they did in this time was really focusing on criminal law, and they didn't touch civil law. They wouldn't dare to go into the whole matriarchal system of inheritance. And what is interesting is that there were a lot of local differences, and that you can see in the meetings that local leaders try to negotiate. So regions where they did not have the matriarchal system, they would say like, well, maybe we can abolish it because we're not so happy with it. And then the Dutch in the meeting would say, yeah, we're not going there. You can come to us if you all agree. Then we can talk about it again. So yeah, and I really like your point about how adat not only by being codified changes, but also by being institutionalized. And because you also see that the law courts were also differently organized, organized in different ways. And some had like 6 local leaders as judges, and then the Dutch only wanted 2. So they had to figure out how to do that. So that had a huge impact. So it should definitely have more yeah, spend more attention to the institutional aspect of this. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Very elaborate and fruitful discussion and questions. Let's open the floor for comments and questions for Sanne. Are there any questions, comments? I don't see any hands. Yes.
Sanne, yes, thank you very much for already fascinating presentations. I really learned a lot actually, and also for my own research. Maybe I can see it as like I'm doing something downstream, and you are really in the upstream, you know, in the process, in the headline of the process about things. But my question is. Maybe you have mentioned it, but I missed it a little bit. So, what actually the main objective of this legal process? I mean, is it really like standardizing the adat, or well, the word civilizing maybe that's used, but what exactly is it? I mean, Kinderen knows it's very diverse, maybe, or did he want just to introduce a minimum standard of civilized, maybe, and what is that actually was, and in the long process into, well, so, say like state formation, for example, on what level Kinderen project was you can look at it at. I mean, is it still in the exploratory, preparatory into more modern state construction or something? Maybe I can make a little bit comparison with the taxations regulation, for example, which is myriad. It is diverse, and what the colonial government tried to do is actually just to standardize, just to make a minimum that the taxation it's can be operated taxable, and there was imposed an idea of justice. I mean, when people pay certain amount of money, it's according to their, taxable capacity. So that's the, I can say that's the basis minimum of this, reformations, tax reformation along the way since earlier, even early 19th century until. Well, they use the word efficiency, they use the word modern, rational thing. But what I really see on the stake is actually it's just to make a reasonable tax to everybody, so it can really avoid the people can hurt their feeling. It's the feeling injustice by taxes. So trying to really how you call it, make a kind of benchmark of justice feeling, feeling of justice. But that's really very difficult indeed. But for example, why it took so long for land tax, for example, since early 19th century, and it just the final question it just come out only like in the 1920s. Yeah, that's what Hohenholz's dissertations tell about. So maybe the comparison is not really exactly the same with the taxation. Of course, the adult law it's different. And but again, my question is, yeah, with this, with his task, huge task, Kinderen, maybe what is his mind, maybe minimum objective or minimum most rational objective that he can reach out, and then maybe by using that he dealing with different law structure or law regulations, adat legal in many places in Indonesia again. And also because you're referring to Minangkabau where Islamic influence is very strong, I would imagine, for example, there are the differences also based on the contents of the local adat law. It's very much about religious content as well. So yeah, it's a punishment, of course, but it's penal code or criminal law maybe, but maybe different. I mean, maybe you can also use the mapping, geographic mapping of this religious influence, because in the Eastern, perhaps it's more Christian, Western, Sumatra is, yeah, it's also always considered as very strong Islamic area, as also Aceh, maybe it's comparable, West Java or something like that. So maybe that's also another thing helps you to, yeah, to solve the puzzle, maybe about you said it's the blank spot of your research. But that's my notes on it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is very helpful. Yeah, I think our research really complements each other. I hope maybe together we can find all these translators. Yeah, I think you're completely right that, so what's interesting here is I think that Der Kinderen and Van der Bossen represent two different opinions or two different views that the Dutch have. And I think Der Kinderen is very much in line with what you described with the tax regulations, where he's all about standardizing. He wants to have, if something happens in one region, he wants to happen it in the other region in the exact same way. He wants the courts to look similar. And I think, so it's coming from sort of rolling out the system that by then is in place in Java, where they have done that already. And they're like, okay, the next place where we're going to do that is West Sumatra. and we're just going to do that. And the experience in Java was that they would implement certain local elements into the organization of the courts. So who were the important people that had to be present in the court? And I think he's also trying to do that here in West Sumatra. And I think he realizes during the meetings that the differences between the regions are very big and that it's almost impossible what he's trying to do. And then there's Van der Bosse, who is really interested in Adat, but he believes that Islam does not have a place in Adat. So he keeps talking about if we just remove the Islamic elements, then we go back to the old Adat, and that is fine. So he's less interested, I think, in standardizing the system. So you see a little bit of a clash of two, well, a somewhat older generation and a newer generation here, and a liberal and a more conservative point of view, maybe. And then all these regional differences, and you're completely right, because it's very interesting to see how in each region the discussion is different and the interests are different. And yeah, so there's a lot in there, but I think definitely I could like show more how Der Kinder is part of that idea of that standardizing is an efficiency and justice, that's important. And it's coming also from a moment in the Netherlands. The same happened, where in the early 19th century each province or each city still had their own laws and regulations and language and different kinds of courts, and then they all make it uniform and standardize it. So yeah, thanks.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, perhaps there's room for one more final question, but then we really have to wrap up our first day of the symposium. Is there any final question or comment? If not, then thank you very much, Sanne. It was very interesting, and another round of digital applause from all of us.
Thank you all.
And yeah, that wraps up the first day of this symposium. Thank you very much, all of you and all the spectators behind your computers through YouTube or otherwise. It was a very fruitful, thought-provoking day and sessions. We went from hygienic biological citizenship to Jawi and Dutch colonial policies, and then to Catholic families and the making of modern Indonesia, and then to colonial lawmaking. So a broad range of topics. And not today, but perhaps tomorrow during the closing remarks, we can also reflect on perhaps commonalities between these themes, which have been discussed today and which will be discussed tomorrow. But that's something for tomorrow. We look forward to tomorrow, 5 sessions more, and across all these different time zones, we can say good evening or good morning or good afternoon, and we hope to see you all tomorrow. All right.
All right.
See you all tomorrow.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Thank you. Goodbye. And have a very nice afternoon.